Hello and welcome to Them's Writing Words, a podcast discussing selected fanfictions from the world of pastel horse literature. My name is Scribbler, and I will be your moderator today. Joining me for this discussion we have Goombasa.
Hello, everybody.
Illya Leonov.
Hello.
Mami Dulugo.
Good to be back.
Neighrator Pony.
Good morning, everyone.
And Thornquill.
Hello, everyone.
And I managed to get through the introductions without telling everyone to fuck off.
It's quite an accomplishment.
It's a
You gotta know
Christmas
that
miracle.
Scribbler.
Cygnus wasn't here. I would have told Cygnus.
Yeah.
Scribbler, always raising the bar.
Yep. Bar raised? No, bar raised. Fuck off. Oh, fuck!
There it is.
Fuck you
Is that
all.
41 seconds? Well done. It's a new record.
Right. Today we're looking at the fanfic Relinquish the Sun by Ep07. It was chosen by Illya, and he's going to read the synopsis.
The two great dragon clans have united and summoned Celestia to their lair, demanding that Celestia give up her hold on the sun and moon. Celestia and her advisors must now decide between surrendering Celestia's greatest gift to Equestria and a war with some of the most powerful and ancient beings in existence. Meanwhile, the Changeling Queen confronts Celestia in Canterlot Castle, pleading for the enfranchisement of her kin. Can Celestia trust the Changelings, or is there too much to lose with an existential threat on the horizon?
Thank you. This story was published on the 21st of March 2014 and clocks in at 25,024 words. So, as ever, we are going to start with the non-spoilery part of the podcast. I will indicate when we go into spoiler territory, and fair warning, the spoiler territory is going to come pretty damn soon because there's some major things that people want to talk about, which they're kind of champing at the bit to get at. So to begin with, tags. Do we believe they're accurate? And we're breaking our streak now of having just one tag per fic, because this one has three: sad, tragedy, and dark. So I'll start with the fic picker himself. Illya, do you think they are accurate?
Yes, I think it's sad, tragic, and dark, and I can't even really imagine anything else that it would be. It's certainly not a slice of life, so yeah, I'd say so.
Goombasa?
It's almost like the author looked at the selection of tags that they had at their disposal and say, yep, I'm going to put every single depressing tag that I can into this story, and I'm going to make them fit. Because I do think that all three of them are accurate, but I'm not used to seeing so much depression together in one story.
You say that, and yet we have read Puppet to her fame.
Don't bring that up!
We should probably do that one at some point.
Oh!
We actually already...
The other podcast...
Yeah, Heroic Review
Yeah,
did
I
that
thought
one.
that was reviewed.
Oh, that's a good point. Heck.
Yeah, because that's the one where Goombasa opened with the classic line.
Fuck this story.
It was the first time... Yep. It was the first time we'd ever heard him swear, ever.
Appropriate
Goodness.
use for it.
To be
Yeah.
fair, I kind of look on that particular episode and cringe a little bit at my own behavior, but I was not a fan of that story at all.
I don't blame you at all. In retrospect, if I was the same person today same person back then as I am today, I don't know if I would have adapted it. But we live and learn. Mami, what do you think about the tags on the current story, Relinquish the Sun?
I think they fit way too well. Like, the author was challenging himself to fit this to the story.
So you reckon the tags came first?
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I would argue tragedy only really fits because of the side characters. We'll get into that later.
I'd argue that the tragedy kind of fits because of the ending, but that's definitely a spoiler thing. Although that said, whenever I see tragedy in a story, I do tend to think character death.
Yeah, exactly.
Neighrator, what do you think?
I'm fine with the tags.
But you're not fine with the story?
We'll get into that, but I enjoyed the story overall, but a few things came very close to ruining it for me.
Ooh. Thornquill, what do you think?
You know, I'll say sad, I'm okay with. Tragedy does fit. And I know that this story technically fits the definition of dark, but for me, I don't think this story was dark enough to warrant the dark tag. I don't know, I think if you wanted to say that dark applies, you could say that, and this is slightly spoiler, but there's war and there's violence, but none of it was to a level that I would read and say, oh, that was dark. It just didn't hit that level for me. And honestly, I would say that the drama tag would fit this story, just because of the character interaction between different conflicting parties. There was more conflict between various characters and what they said they wanted than there was dark elements for me.
Interesting.
You could be right, and somehow, the existential, 3 species facing an existential crisis, you would think would be a pretty dark, context, but somehow it doesn't seem nearly as much as like something like Puppeteer Fame.
Yeah, like I said, this story technically it meets the technical criteria for having the dark tag, but it's just the degree that doesn't work for me. And I mean that's not like a criticism. It's just there.
I think part of it might be in the descriptors. I mean, there was a lot of dark things that happened in the story, but they weren't described in gory detail, so that might have helped.
Yeah, this isn't Cupcakes or Rainbow Factory levels of dark. Not gratuitously dark.
Yeah.
I mean, when we get into the spoiler territory, I'd argue that it is thematically incredibly dark. Like, I'd say this is thematically a darker story than The Cold Hand of Mercy, which was literally about death.
I would agree.
I don't know that I would agree. I did read the story. I just wasn't there for the review, unfortunately, so I can't speak to it as competently. But I don't know that I would agree. But that's another point.
Well, The Cold Hand of Mercy had a very hopeful tone to it throughout. I mean, it had dark things happening, but the edge that the narrative took was that it get better. But with this, it's very doom and gloom the whole way through.
Kind of. We'll get more into that.
It's a very bleak story.
It's a bleak fic.
Yeah. We are going to get into that really quite soon, because now I'm going to ask for a summary of the story from Illya. A non-spoilery summary, please, Illya?
That's quite a bit of a challenge. Dragons ask Celestia to give up her control of the sun, or else. And she has to decide whether or not she wants to do that. Meanwhile, the Changeling Queen, which is not Chrysalis, appears and asks that changelings be allowed to live among the Equestrian citizens. So we have these two elements playing off of one another throughout the story, and that's about as far as I can go without spoiling it.
So, as far as spoilers go, we are going to kick in now, and Illya's going to describe the rest of the story. If you would like to go and read this for yourself, or if in fact you would like to listen to it, Illya has a very good version of it on his channel, apart from one bloody VA who plays somebody called Inkstain and Queen Cocoon. I mean, she's shit. But,
Scribbler was referring to herself there, for those of you who haven't listened to it.
Okay.
And I would thoroughly
yeah, it was
disagree.
me. I wasn't just randomly shitting on some other VA.
I was going to
like,
say, I don't
whoa.
think I've ever heard you be so vitriolic towards anyone VA work before.
This podcast made you a bitter bitch.
Yeah, I was kind of hoping the fact that you all know me, you would guess that I was referring to myself.
Now, I would have to say that your portrayal of Cocoon, and I'm not sucking up to, but damn, that was good. When she got upset,
Really?
It was some of the best acting I've heard from unpaid actors.
Right at the end there, I
thank you.
agree.
I mean, that's
I
a
will-
given with her.
Well, thank you. I was going to say that the other VA who in this story is Goombasa, and simply saying the character he plays is a spoiler, so spoiler warning here. Because Goombasa, who do you play?
I played Queen Chrysalis in that reading.
And in
Very
fact,
well.
we both kind of played the same character, didn't we?
Yes, actually. Yeah.
Because I was the character Queen Chrysalis is disguised as for the entire story, and then suddenly, randomly at the end, she turns into Queen Chrysalis, and Goombasa gets to give his wonderful rendition, which, please, casting agents of the world, he's actually really good at Queen Chrysalis, which...
It was fascinating, wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would not have guessed at all that it was him. Like, he did a really good job.
Thank you.
I love the fact that you literally, the reason that you played Chrysalis in a couple of things was that you, for a joke, submitted a Chrysalis audition to No Place Like Home, and then you got cast in a lot of stuff.
Yeah. Actually, I think after I submitted that audition, you came to me with like 3 different stories and asked me to play Queen Chrysalis in all of them.
Yep. One of them is Queen Chrysalis kidnaps Rainbow Dash for 10 minutes, which is one of my hands-down favourite stories I've ever done. I love that. It's like, what do you think? I thought this would take longer. Go and listen to that if you haven't. He's amazing. We're moving on. Yes. Summary of the story, Illya, with spoilers intact, please.
Okay, spoiler time. Celestia goes to a meeting with dragons. The dragons ask to turn over the control of the sun and moon to the dragons themselves, which means essentially letting go of control and letting the natural elements of the story. She goes back and consults with her council, and basically there's a big argument in the council hall, which is my favorite part of the story. I love the way they bicker. And but she just decides that because giving up the control of the sun would prevent her from reuniting with her sister, who was still in exile at the time on the moon, she would not go along with the dragon's demands. And she has an assistant, Inkstain, who is sort of an OC character that tags along with her and lets her bounce thoughts off of her and such. And so the dragons attack, and so then they decide they're going to create a standing army, which is the Wonderbolts, and go to war against the dragons. Even though Celestia thinks it's a bad idea, she's still holding out for her sister. And the dragons do some really destructive things, and towns are destroyed, and so they finally face the fact that they've got no choice but to give in to the demands. So, meanwhile, the Changeling Queen has appeared in the castle some point during the early part of the story. Her name is Cocoon at the time. And, boy, everybody goes crazy because changelings in this canon of this story are shot on sight, well, killed on sight. And so they're ready to kill Cocoon as soon as she appears, but she begs for asylum, and so Celestia grants it and puts her in a holding cell. So all during the war with the dragons, the changelings been down in the holding cell, and when it's time to give up, Celestia says, well, maybe, because Cocoon has intimated that she might have an answer to the problem. So Celestia goes down and talks to Cocoon, and together they sneak over to the dragon lair and steal the egg. Oh, I might have to highlight this fact, that the entire reason that this dragon takeover has been initiated is because the dragons have stopped fighting among themselves and have banded together because they have the first uncontested heir in millennia. And so the two main dragons, I don't do names. Some of them have the names of these dragons.
And Shu Yin.
Yeah, Fukang and Shu Yin. Fukang and Zhu Yin are
I swear you just said fucking shoeing.
Fucking
I was trying not to say it.
Like, Spike is a fucking shoe-in to be that heir.
I didn't think about that.
No,
But
I thought
Somehow I
you
didn't either. Leave it to Scribbler.
To wrap this up, Celestia and Cocoon sneak in and steal the egg and take it back to the castle, and the dragons take to fighting amongst themselves, and they kill each other, and so the dragon war is averted, and now they have an egg. Well, Cocoon was planning on having her people become part of Equestria as part of the deal for saving them from the dragons. And I'm not certain that that was ever established, but it was certainly Cocoon's thought on the whole matter. But Celestia decides that's a bad idea and exiles all of the changelings out of Equestria. They usher them out. There's a few words about the egg, and that's the end of the story. And it's Celestia's nefarious plotting that I think most people are going to find exceptionally difficult to swallow. I did at first. And that's it.
That's a story, pretty much. It's a good scene.
So, to plunge our hands straight into the fire, characterization. Do we feel it's accurate for the characters, in particular Celestia and Chrysalis? We will touch upon the OC characters in a moment, but for now we'll stick to the two most prominent canon characters of Her Royal Sun Buttus and Her Royal Bugnus. Illya, since you picked the story, how do you feel that characterization was?
Well, this has been an emotional roller coaster for me, because I spent the last couple of weeks the story a couple of times to try to find out why I hated the ending so much. I originally decided to record this story because of the dragon voices and the way it was written. I liked the prose, and I loved the bickering between the two main characters. But as I usually do, I recorded the story as I read it for the first time. And when I got to the end of it, Celestia's betrayal, you can use no other descriptor, I think, for that, just ate me up. I hated the story after I'd read it for a long time because of that, because I thought, that's just so un-Celestia. But really, respect, and in reading it in subsequent times, I don't think it was. First of all, it had to be there, I think, to go along with canon. So the changelings had to be enemies. That's the only way that could work. And she had to do what she could to save Equestria. So perhaps Celestia is just a bit more nefarious than we all think she is. So I guess in the end, I'm okay with that. As far as Chrysalis goes, it's very difficult to say. I don't know how much she was like Dane and Cocoon, who are the same character, basically. It's hard to say. We only get to see she gets really ticked off and probably stays that way for the rest of the millennium. But I think she's probably in character. The rest of the characters are much OCs, so hard to say about that. I've changed my tune since I originally picked this story because I had problems with Celestia. And now I don't so much, so I'm backing off of that position. I'll allow other people to speak on that.
Neighrator?
So I wanted to read this excerpt, so just focusing on Celestia, because I gather that's the character that most people are going to have the most problems with the characterization about. There's more than one place in the story where I think she behaves really, really immorally, and in a way that I just reconcile the Celestia from the show with the Celestia we see in this fic. I would like to, if I may, read a few paragraphs from the story that sort of illustrate my point.
Sure.
This is from the scene where Celeste is in the dungeon talking to Queen Cocoon through the bars of her cell. Celestia's next words bore all the weight of an executioner's axe. Because you feed on love. Doesn't every pony? Asked Cocoon dismissively. Ponies not impersonate one another to feed off the affections of loved ones. Cocoon smoldered behind the bars. If changelings were not killed in sight in your lands, perhaps they wouldn't either. And what is a changeling really stealing by entering Canterlot with a face of a pony from Appaloosa? An identity, a name and reputation. Not if no one recognizes the borrowed face. We make our own identities. Our appearances are ancillary. Even if that were true, your presence weakens all unfortunate enough to love your borrowed forms. You're parasites of the most important emotion that ponies can share. Celestia's words you in anger in Cocoon. What are you saying then? She shouted. That we're morally obligated not to that we should all drown ourselves for your convenience? We didn't choose our natures. Should we die for them? Her voice rang out against the stone walls. Celestia waited for the last echo to subside. Perhaps, she muttered. So I'll stop it there, but just notion that Celestia says, no, yeah, you shouldn't exist. I mean, you're kind of, depending on how you feel about changeling canon and whether, and principally whether or not that changelings feeding on the love of a pony or some other creature inherently harms them, that is not established in this story, and it's not established in show canon either. But this whole concept that Celestia says, like, no, you can't exist. I know that you're a sentient creature and you're reaching out to me diplomatically in good faith, but I want to kill you all. You should all just die. I cannot really reconcile that, among other things, with the Celestia we know from the show.
Yeah, NP, that is actually probably one of the most important lines, important segments of the story. And I don't think the author realized it, because that question, the changelings are asking, should we just die for our natures? You could build an entire story around that alone, and it was such a good question, and the story never really did anything with it. And I think this is the huge problem, is that why in this world is there a standing law to kill changelings on sight?
And that's the other problem. I really find it hard to believe that Celestia, we don't know that, maybe there was a long war with changelings, but even under that circumstances, I find it hard to believe that Celestia would ever say it's acceptable to kill a sentient being to summarily execute them on sight. Absolutely not.
See, that's the problem. There is no answer whatsoever in this story for why changelings are killed on sight. The reader's kind of left to assume, because, fans of this story will have, seen a Candorlot wedding. They'll know that later in the timeline, the changelings attack, almost destroy Candorlot and all that. But up to this point in the story, that hasn't happened, and we have absolutely no idea what changelings could have possibly done in the past that warrants this treatment. And there's just no explanation or reason given whatsoever as to why the changelings are such a bad deal. We're not left with enough to follow Celestia's reasoning here.
Do you think there should have been some exposition then?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, or is this a treatise on the nature of blind prejudice?
The problem is there's just not enough. If it is just blind prejudice, then that would have been made more clear in the story. Frankly, I think we needed a lot more backstory on the changelings and even a bit more on the dragons to really make this world feel real and like these things that are happening are justified.
Illya?
Well, yeah, the big problem with the story may not even be Celestia's behavior in the story. It may more likely be this order to kill changelings on sight, which isn't explained. In light of that order, she probably acted properly. So the order itself, the reason for the order, may be the difficult part.
Goombasa?
Going back to the point about blind prejudice as well, another big issue with that is the fact that it's primarily presented to us through the lens of Celestia's thoughts. And Celestia, for as long-lived as she is, in this story in particular, I think she's already been alive for, or at least has lived years at this point. I think that was mentioned somewhere in the fic.
Yeah, it's like almost right before the series starts, but still a few years out.
Yes, and because of that, I find it very difficult to believe that a being as long-lived as Celestia, having seen as much as she is, would be okay with the idea of blind prejudice, or would still be affected by that. I mean, what did the changelings do to warrant that sort of attitude from a being as long-lived as her? Did they piss in their Cheerios or something?
And thus it was in the ancient past, Celestia did decree all changelings to be unclean and killed upon their first sight, for they hath urinated into her cereal.
It's like ancient equestrian cave paintings that depict Celestia taking the piss.
The piss. That's even better than the actual joke. And thus the word was changed in equestrian to depisting.
But you all talk about how Celestia's character, I actually take a bit more umbrage with Chrysalis is portrayed in this story.
Go on then, because I put Chrysalis on there for a reason, so let's hear it.
Well, first of all, I will admit we don't get a good sense of her personality because Chrysalis as herself is only there at the very, very end. For most of the rest of the story, she is putting on the persona of Inkstain, which, first of all, I already call foul on because given how Chrysalis acts, it's very difficult to see her as actually being a good stealth agent at all. Even before she becomes queen, because she's made absolutely no effort, for example, in a royal wedding, to actually act like Cadence. I find it very difficult to see her as portrayed well in this story because I just don't see that cockiness, that sort of arrogance that I associate with the character.
Is there a reason you don't really see her as capable of it, even in her younger form?
Even in her younger form, yes. I just, I'm trying to sort my thoughts out. For some reason, the way she's portraying this story and the way that I see her as a character later on, there's a gap there that just isn't filling in, and I'm not sure why.
I think some of that might be chronological. Inkstain was a wonderful little character, and perhaps Chrysalis was a wonderful, sweet character, although that's difficult to imagine if she's someone who would be shot on sight. But we don't know exactly how much time she's had to seethe after this story before the wedding.
See, that's exactly my problem, because at the end of this, she is so calm and reserved that I cannot that character with the Chrysalis we see in her first appearance in the show, which is just fucking bananas. Like, she must have gone insane at some point for that to be how she turned out, because she's so, like, vindictive and fun and not this character at all, that there's
and not
such
redeemable
a difference in how they are.
Yeah, even in her later appearances in some of the later seasons where we see her, like when she was trying to create the copied main six, she was still incredibly arrogant, incredibly vindictive, very self-centered, very wrapped up in her own head. She's very much a narcissist.
Yeah, we don't ever get a sense that Chrysalis is out for Celestia personally, which this story's version of Chrysalis would absolutely have it out for Celestia personally. It's very odd because throughout this whole story, as the assistant Inkstain, the author tells us over and over, she's practically fawning and almost worshipful of Celestia. She's sweet, she's constantly supportive of her, she's constantly trying to help, and yes, she gets betrayed at the end, but yeah, like Mami said, this is a very, she's very calm and icy about it, whereas in the show, she is bombastic, she is just lashing out all over the place, she's a narcissist, absolutely. It just doesn't click together.
But what happens when your object of worship turns on you and betrays you? Perhaps that's a breaking point.
Well, like I said, I
Maybe.
could see that if in the show it seemed like she had it out for Celestia personally, but since we're lacking that, since she more just seems to be almost like an aimless kind of hurricane, she will hurt whatever comes in her path. It doesn't really matter. I don't personal connection that the author built into this story,
including her own subjects, because in the show proper, it's never really shown that she has a great fondness for other changelings either. She enjoys a position of power, but she doesn't really show any sort of love or responsibility towards her own subjects.
Yeah, she is inherently cruel.
Yep. Whereas in this story, it seems to suggest that she has not only a great respect for Cocoon as both her mother and her leader, but also for all changelings, as she willingly gives up herself and reveals herself to be with the rest of her kind.
We're dancing on the edge of my next point, which I'm chomping at the bit to get at, but I want to give everybody enough time to say what they want to say about the characterization.
I was going to say that, is this not the pitfall of writing a prequel, that you have to be able to get a character from A to B, and B is canon. So no matter wherever you place them within A, unless it's already as close to canon as makes no difference, it's always going to seem like they're out of character.
That is a point that I would like to come back to when we discuss the ending as a whole, is definitely the pitfall of writing a prequel.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of characterization, just in general, I think something this fic suffers from is the fact that it's trying so hard to be canon compliant in a time when these gaps weren't really filled, but now they are. So, like, reading back through the story, all I can think is, oh, that's not how that would go. Oh, that's not how that person is. And it's like, that's not how it was at the time. So I think at the time, this was probably a much better fic, but in retrospect, it just doesn't work as well.
Good point.
Well, that is it though, because Celestia has always maintained a certain characterization throughout the show that hasn't really deviated. Even with her progression, she's not really deviated from she is the good ruler.
Celestia, I think, works. Or I should say, Celestia. I think we're pretty much all agreed does not work. The author's characterization of Celestia does not work. Chrysalis, however, I would argue, is believable, and that's actually a quite plausible origin story.
I actually think Celestia's characterization does work, but only if you're willing to take a more realistic view of what being a ruler for 2,000 years would entail.
I would say more cynical and not more realistic.
I would agree with you if she had like any kind of warmth whatsoever, but she's kind of a stone cold bitch this entire story, even in her reactions to other people. So it's like there's none of that. I mean, she's the sun princess, but she doesn't have any of that warm mom energy in her personality at all throughout this whole thing. I mean, who the fuck would ever think that Celestia would say, "Oh, should I die? Perhaps." I mean, that's not her.
Although she does have a motherly instinct towards Inkstain, which is why it feels more like a betrayal when Inkstain turns out to be a changeling, and thus rocks Celestia's entire worldview.
Do you think that was like a turning point, and then after that, Celestia starts to think of like, oh, I shouldn't be such a bitch, and then she becomes this kind of warm, motherly, nurturing Celestia that we see in the show?
I don't know about that. I just think that there are moments where Celestia from canon is kind of visible in this version of her.
Oh, don't forget now that Celestia has had a great revelation during this story. When she thought she was the great ruler who could do no wrong, and suddenly, towards the end of the story, she's doubting her ability to even be the princess of the ruler of the kingdom. So she had an epiphany as well.
But at this point, she's already banished Luna to the moon, and she's had those doubts, so I wouldn't really call that much of an epiphany. It's more like this entire story is just her kind of fumbling her way through being a princess, which at this point she should already have pretty down pat for having lived like thousands of years.
Which is also sort of highlighted during those scenes where she's talking to Luna's crown in the moonlight.
Thornquill, I think you have something to say?
Yeah, I think the only other point I would make on Celestia's characterization is I actually can believe her characterization in this story when I do all of the work myself and fill in the gaps without the author's help. Because I can see Celestia as being a more negative character. There's actually a story called Monsters by Jojo. I did a reading of his other story of Queens, where Celestia is a borderline evil character. She's a tyrant in the wake of her banishing Nightmare Moon because she's trying to crush all possibility of evil. The reason it works in that story and not in this one is because we have a lot more backstory. We understand what has happened to her and made her just more fearful. In this one, we have no idea why she's so scared of the changelings. If we had just had that, I think we would have understand why she kept Cocoon imprisoned in a cell for weeks and weeks and weeks with no nourishment whatsoever. We can understand why she ignored her and basically didn't even try to solve the problem. But we have none of that. And I think that's why her actions feel so out of character, is just because the author didn't do enough to build that version of her character.
Yeah, I can go with that. As an addendum to this first point, which we're half an hour in, and we've only just we're still on the first point.
It was the biggest one.
Morality. True. That's what she said. Morality. Was Celestia morally justified in... Don't laugh. I very nearly made it through the entire point without anybody laughing. Was Celestia morally justified in kidnapping the egg? Is it morally permissible to kill changelings on sight? Was Celestia morally justified in exiling changelings after Cocoon saved her kingdom? And does this mean that Chrysalis' attack on Canterlot in canon is morally justified? Neighrator, this was your point, so elaborate.
Hardly know where to start. Anybody read the sequel to Orson's Ender's Game called Speaker for the Dead? Anybody read that book?
Yes, but it's been decades.
Can't blame you. It was not nearly as good, and I would say like the series is really overhyped. I'm going to make this as brief as possible because I have a lot to say on this point, so I will do my best to keep myself in check. But this, as of whether or not it is, what is permissible when your species is facing extinction? What is morally permissible and what is not? Most people, I think, would agree that when you're in a fight for your life, if someone jumps you on the street and they're trying to kill you, they've got a knife in their hand, that most people would agree that you're morally justified in fighting back however you see fit. If that means kicking them in the bollocks, right? If that means stabbing them, it's you versus him. You do what you have to survive. I think that same question applies. Ponies, as a ruler of ponies, Celestia is now facing an existential crisis where essentially only one species can survive. The changelings have offered the ponies a choice, or I should say the illusion of choice. Either give up the sun or we will destroy everything. So pretty much the ponies are in an untenable situation. We don't exactly know what the dragons are for the sun, and whether that means that there would still be a day in the night or stuff like that. But let's assume, for the sake of argument, that if the dragons get control of the sun, like, everyone will freeze or roast, or there'll be a tremendous loss of life, if not extinction of every sentient race in Equestria except the dragons. So in a situation like that, most people would agree that kidnapping is immoral. But in a situation where your species is facing extinction, is it, unless you kidnap this egg, unless you kidnap this child, is that morally permissible? I would argue that it is, for the same reason that it's morally permissible to fight back against an attacker. If it's going to be a fight to the death, you're allowed to fight back any way you see fit. It sort of leads into another question, though. So that's the ponies versus the dragons. Now, the ponies versus the changelings is another question. So Celestia says that, like, that's in your nature. It is in your nature to you're a parasite, and you're like bugs, and you should all be killed on sight, and you should all kill yourselves for our convenience. That's kind of a lot to swallow there. A lot of it kind of hinges on how you believe changeling works. I have seen no evidence in canon, in show canon, or in this story that ponies, that changelings feeding on ponies inherently harms them in any way. I don't sign off on that, but Celestia seems to think so. And so for that reason, she feels that she's morally justified not only to kill any changeling on sight, but then even after Queen Cocoon, essentially saves their kingdom, not only save all ponies, but also all the other sentient races of Equestria. Even after that, Celestia seems to believe that they cannot coexist. This is another fight for this is another existential crisis of ponies versus changelings, and therefore in that case she's morally justified in exiling all the changelings from Equestria. She believes that there's no situation under which they can coexist, and that leads into a third question. Now is, if that's the case, Celestia has said, is all right, well, this is it's you versus us, and we're going to fight back by any means necessary, including betraying Queen Cocoon after there was at least an implied agreement that if I help you, that our two races will try to get along and to try to coexist. If Chrysalis says, all right, fine, if that's the way it is, I'm going to therefore attack you by any means necessary. And if this is an existential crisis, if only one race can survive, then anything goes, including, for example, impersonating Princess Cadence, and stealing her love, and things like that. So it's a very interesting question to me. I only bring up Speaker for the Dead because that's a kind of a central question in there also. What is morally permissible in a struggle for existence? I talked a whole lot there. I'm so sorry.
Don't apologize. You made a really good point. Thornquill?
No, you're fine. And yeah, I think you summed up a lot pretty well there. And I think my response is that there isn't anything in this story that is impossible to do. I think you absolutely can have Celestia morally justified in kidnapping the egg, morally justified in killing changelings on sight, morally justified in exiling them, and Chrysalis's attack being morally justified after. The problem is that, again, we need to do a lot of work to set up why Celestia would be morally justified in killing changelings on sight, later betraying them. And that is entirely what's missing. So yeah, I would agree that Celestia is morally justified in kidnapping the egg. Frankly, that's a solution ending the war that probably was a lot less cruel and bloody than others that, could have been pursued, both by the author or the characters in the story. The moral issues regarding the changelings are where this story really falls apart. I think Chrysalis is justified in attacking Canterlot after this. Not tremendously, because at this point in the story, it's been revealed that the reason the changelings sought asylum from Equestria is because the dragons kicked them out of their home. And once the dragons are defeated, the changelings can go home and presumably be restored to equilibrium, so any attack on Canterlot would just be vengeance. So that's kind of morally justified just because of how the story set it up, but the middle bit, it's not working. I don't think.
I'd agree. So it could be that this is what the author meant. This was a central question that the author meant to pose in Writing Words. It very nearly worked with a little more work. I think it might have been fleshed out a lot better and worked a lot better. But it's always a really interesting question for me, something I think a lot about.
Goombasa?
I would agree on most points that have already been made. When it comes to kidnapping the egg, I do think that there is good justification for that. When it comes to betraying the trust of the changelings, less so, because the changelings, their nature is sort of hinted at to be parasitic, but they are also a sentient race. They are capable of communication. They're capable of understanding. They're capable of reason. And when one of them comes to you and tries in earnest to reason with you and come to an impasse, come to an understanding, and then you just turn around and on that, it does not paint Celestia in a very good light.
I think it just doesn't work at all.
I mean, even if you had a moment in there where Celestia was given reason to suspect that Cocoon was not being honest, like what if Inkstain had been revealed to be Chrysalis earlier in the story, and Celestia was like, "I've been lied to all my life," a moment like that. It's not great. Even then, that could give Celestia something to seize onto, and in the tragedy of her character, blow that out of proportion and wreck everything, even when reconciliation was still possible. Again, unfortunately, though, we don't get anything like that. Cocoon is never anything in this story forthright, helpful, honest. Neither is Inkstain. They have they don't even have flaws as characters, really. So there's just nothing to grab onto.
Mami?
A big problem for me with this story and the entire question of morality when it comes to it is I don't buy the premise. Like, Neighrator talked about the whole sun thing and giving up the sun and how that would descend everything into chaos, but that's just what Celestia believes would happen. And the dragons say no, things would just go back to the natural order and the sun and moon would rise as they wanted to, and seasons would come back and just be what they were before, which is basically, our world. And that was kind of played as like a joke in season 1, that periphery is so terrifying because that's how it is, but they're trying to pass it off as like a really serious moral conundrum here. So it doesn't really work for me because, yeah, they might have to adapt to that situation, but I don't think like everyone would fucking die and just drop dead instantly if Celestia stopped controlling the moon and the sun. But that's looking at what is this story's canon versus what's show canon. And I don't think the two line up nearly as much as a fic that's supposed to be about being a prequel to the series wants to.
I mean, that's a really interesting question, actually, that I hadn't really looked at. Because I read this as if Celestia gave up control of the sun and the moon and the seasons, they would return to a kind of order that was identical to chaos unless you lived for millennia. Like after that, but for ponies, it's all the same thing because they live and die and nothing is predictable within their lifetimes. And it was said in the story, and it bugged me because it wasn't nearly as huge as an issue, even to the characters as it should have been, that if things went back to the way they were, then basically they would be facing starvation and famine because they couldn't grow reliable crops. And it's an issue that the characters just glossed over, which drives me nuts. It's like, that's the biggest reason you have for holding on to the power that you have.
And Celestia's reason, though, she had an entirely different reason.
True.
No, she did. I'm just saying they should have focused on a reason that everyone should have cared about a lot more. But I'm wondering now with Mami's point if, that was even an issue at all. Does the story give us enough reason to believe that the consequences of relinquishing the sun would actually be apocalypse, or is that something being blown out of proportion? I don't even know.
That's something that was not on the story, and that may have been another failing of the author. We don't exactly know what dragons had planned for the sun. I would imagine that's something Celestia should have gotten clarification on during these negotiation process. It's like, give us the sun. What are you going to do with it? Well, we want 100 years of day and then 100 years by night, and just kind of do the thing. Celestia says, well, that would kill everyone, so I'm not okay with that. If, however, the dragons say, we demand a 25-hour day instead of a 24-hour day, so Celestia says, well, that's not so unreasonable. Even if that means sacrificing her sister, that is an acceptable... Yeah, the question of what the dragons plan to do with the sun exactly is kind of central to the whole story, and the author didn't touch on that at all.
Yeah, just real quick. Another thing with regards to the dragons is, like, at any point, they could just kill everyone in Equestria if they wanted to. So if we're going by reasoning, which the story really tries to when it's talking about these kind of dilemmas, like, they would have no reason to intentionally wreck their land, because if they wanted to do that, they would just do it.
Thornquill?
There's a line at the beginning for... It's basically the only time we get explanation for why the dragons are doing what they're doing. But I bring it up because it's actually one of, I think, the best lines in the story. It's actually really good, where the dragon says, the patterns of the world were different before ponies, but there were patterns nonetheless. We dragons studied their progressions, appreciated their subtleties, and we would do so again. And I love that sets up that they are so far removed from normal perspectives that they can see things from so far away that no one else can. That's beautiful.
So did the author literally write villains so compelling that we actually side with them more than the characters we're supposed to side with?
Yep.
A little bit, maybe.
That's definitely narratively shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah, it's just, I guess
I
the
don't
only...
agree with that.
Oh, but yeah, I'll just finish up real quick here. The only thing I can get from that is that the dragons want things to be the way they were before, which is better suited to them. Like maybe the constant day and night cycle is slowly driving them batty. But there's not a lot we get from that.
It involves us having to fill in the blanks ourselves, which is kind of what fanfiction is supposed to do for us. It's supposed to fill in the blanks of canon. Goombasa?
I wonder if the author had intended us to take away that all of this might somehow go back to the fact that the dragons were fighting each other for so long as well to justify that. Like Thornquill suggested, maybe the day-night cycle is driving them insane, making more aggressive towards each other in some risks. Again, that's me probably reaching a little bit further than the story itself implied.
Mami?
My major problem with this story is if you examine it and with the question of morality, what Celestia does seems moral when you're looking at it from the perspective of ponies. But when you look at it from the perspective of anyone else, they're just fucked up. Like, everything they do, they're almost the villains of this fic. I mean, the dragons are, like, the antagonists and the cast, no doubt, but, like, they kill people on sight, and they control the weather and the whole world around them, despite not being the only people living in it. And it's like, I'm almost sympathetic to the side characters, and I think that was intentional, but at the same time, it's like a villain story almost to read it from Celestia's perspective.
Man, you might have hit on something there. Yeah, are the ponies the baddies in this story?
Well,
the baddies. They take control of the sun and moon. They kidnap an egg.
I'm just literally...
I think they're the baddies.
I'm just getting this image now of Luna coming back, reading through history and going, Celestia, are we the baddies?
when you have a skull on your crown.
Oh, God.
Where did all these dragon bodies come from?
So, when you said you built a new tower on the castle, and you said it was Dragonbone, that wasn't just an architectural term.
That's why Nightmare Moon is all dragon-like.
I think I think there's something worth looking at here. And I think that one of the things that they want to avoid in the story is not just dragons taking control of the sun, but eventually the dragons coming together for any sort of unanimous decision. Because as long as the dragons are fighting amongst themselves, they leave everyone else alone. We can see, obviously, that when they decide to unite, that they're liable to go on a killing spree indiscriminately. I think that paints them as much the bad guys.
Well, maybe it just paints that nobody is a good guy.
Maybe
Thornquill?
Honestly, yeah, maybe that is the point, that nobody is the good guy, because I think this story hit on a really fantastic idea that I actually haven't ever seen other stories focus on as the main point, is that ponies have control of huge amount of the world's natural forces, the weather, the seasons, the sun and the moon. And I've always felt that especially like the griffins or the dragons or anyone else would look over at this like, well, we're screwed, we can't do anything, or they'll just turn off the sun on us. You know, that they have so much power, and that would foment a lot of cultural strife. But yeah, and then it's almost like the dragons are coming back in and doing the exact same thing. Once they unite, then they take all the power. It's almost like they want to take the ponies' place in that regard.
I know we never want to. I never. No. I'm sorry, NP. You are excited. I'm gonna let you go.
Okay, thank you. Now imagine.
Illya just became Kanye
So
West.
MP. I'm gonna let you finish, but sorry. So this idea that you just said that the dragons coming together is like an awful thing for the rest of the sentient races in Equestria. Do we remember when the ponies and unicorns and earth ponies were all fought together in strife, and and they weren't united as a race, and then they had the unicorns controlled the sun, but it was probably something more organic. It could be that maybe the dragons were opposing pony unification in the same way that ponies are now opposing dragon unification. Now that would be an interesting.
I'm going to give this story credit that it has this theme in here at all, and that it got us to think of it and discuss it. It maybe should have capitalized on it a bit more, but I'm going to say that is a really good thing for this story to have done.
It posed a lot of questions, flawed though the premises may be, and so I do still like it overall, despite all my problems with it.
Yeah, we're not on final thoughts there yet, guys. Don't sound like we're winding up. We haven't hit the hour mark
We're
yet.
just getting started.
We have a reputation.
We're still in
to
second
keep
gear.
up. And besides which,
I'm going to say something that you can cut out if you want, because it may not follow what we like to do here. But if this were to be...
you think I cut out anything?
If this were to become political, what I was curious about is that certain people are thinking, well, maybe the dragons are the good guys, and certain people are thinking, well, maybe the ponies are the good guys. And what I'm wondering is, inside and outside of the United States, who would take whose side? Because this is very much like our current political situation, in which one country has gotten way more powerful than a lot of people think they should have gotten. Like I said, you can cut this out.
It's an interesting question. One worth the ponies of the U.S., you think?
Yeah, kind of.
Installed themselves as the world police.
Yeah, they've kind of always been equated to the United States with the naming of their cities and everything. So it does have a very...
Ironically.
Yeah.
Phony.
Equated.
God damn it.
Welcome to Aquarica.
See, I find it deeply ironic because it's in a Canadian cartoon.
Aquarica.
Oh, ew. Okay, that one I don't like.
I mean, when I the ponies are the bad guys, I did want to specifically say, like, from Celestia's point of view, she's good, and from the other people's point of view, she's bad. And I did kind of have America in mind when I came up with that little bit, because I mean, yeah, mean, you're looking at things from your nation's perspective. Your political moves might seem justified, but that's entirely influenced by your media and your culture. And if you don't take the effort to break out of that, you might not see how other people are being affected and how other people view you.
Oh man, we might need a whole new podcast, you guys.
But
Oh God.
well, isn't that just the same as all aspects of history, that everybody's the hero of their own story? This is just it on a much, much wider scale.
But in this case, the dragons have the atomic weapons.
They're dragons. I mean, in this story, they are very godlike, which I like.
They are atomic weapons.
Yeah, I must admit, I like this version of dragons better than the canon one we got. But
we'll get there. I have a lot to say. Chopping out the bit.
So we're going to move on from... fucking hell, we're going to move on from the first point of characterization. No, we're not. It's more characterization. Shit. What do we think of the OC characters? The dragons, Queen Cocoon of the Changelings. Shit. Neighrator. Oh.
There it is.
Neighrator is...
What blunt did everyone hit before this podcast?
Neighrator.
I don't know. But apparently he's now the daddy of the... You're the daddy of the chat, Neighrator.
I'm the Neighrator familius. Right.
I love it.
And I did say earlier, the first person who says daddy, I will stab them.
Squirrel of Family Daddy.
Nah.
Ah!
So you get cut.
Narrator, answer the bloody question before she gets started.
Two characters, the dragons, Queen Cocoon, the Changelings. The OC characters, I do love the dragons. Especially, particularly that first scene where Celestia is has an audience with the dragons. Just the way they portray themselves, just the whole condescending, like, "Oh, aren't you sweet? You got your little crown and you raise the sun and moon. You're so sweet." And Celestia says, like, "Well, you never asked for control of the sun before. I've been doing this for 2,000 years," and they all have a good laugh. So yeah, I could see how that's cute. You think you've been on this earth a long time, long lived. I'm a dragon. So yeah, I do like dragons in particular. Queen Cocoon, I like Chrysalis. Like I said, this story would serve as a really good origin.
Well, not so much Chrysalis
Yeah,
as
Chrysalis is
Inkstain.
Inkstain. I think this actually serves as a pretty good origin story for Chrysalis and why she is so crazy. Because like if Celestia had pulled what she pulled in this story, that would pretty much cheese me off for the rest of my life. Also, and I would be singularly hell bent on revenge because that was what they call a dick move. So yeah, in terms of the OCs, I like them. It's actually I think it's actually Celestia, the canon characters, the non-OCs that I have the biggest problem with. The OCs are good.
Goombasa?
I would say most of them are pretty good. I think we touched on Inkstain and Cocoon a bit while we were talking about Chrysalis and Celestia. So I think somebody brought up the fact that they don't really have that many flaws, or they don't display that many flaws in this story. The closest that Cocoon comes to, I think, is that she got justifiably angry during her conversation with Celeste. I did like the dragons, but when it comes to most of the other pony characters that we're introduced to, I don't even really remember their names.
It was Jetstream who founded the Wonderbolts. He was given kind of an arc in this story, and I kind of think it was a bit tacked on. I'm not sure what other than serving as an origin story for the Wonderbolts, he was given more screen time than he deserved. I think we came away not knowing. Yeah,
we ended on him. It felt like the entire story ended on him because it was his arc, and yet he'd been absent for most of the story.
I think Jetstream is probably the only OC that I have a problem with. I'm not sure exactly what they was trying to accomplish with that.
What about the one that existed just to die?
Oh, him. Yeah, he got roasted by a dragon, poor fella.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right.
Flamed
Yeah,
into a fucking
Bernie
red shirt. Every story needs a red shirt.
Referring back to the story, for the record, though, I'm not a big fan of the idea of introducing named characters specifically to kill them off. Just it's a pet peeve of mine in any sort of storytelling medium.
Yeah, I mean, I like that chapter just because of how it was written and the thought process, but it almost felt like a loosely connected one-shot. It just didn't fit with the rest of the narrative.
What would have been? How much worse off would the story have been if the author had just omitted that part completely?
I think it was they were trying to structure the scene so it was never entirely sure how close the dragon was until the final line, which I admired it for that we thought he was taking a message, whereas in actual fact the message was about 3 feet behind him and covered in scales. Yeah, apart from that final line, we could scrap that chapter.
I'm going to disagree, honestly. And I think, again, this comes down to the story being structured a bit poorly as opposed to this being a bad decision to write this chapter. Because I think if this chapter isn't the first time we actually switch a new point of view character, it's very close. It's funny because I was actually thinking when I was reading the story, why isn't Inkstain a point of view character? And then I knew the answer by the end of the story. Through the middle of the story, the narration does take a very it takes a huge step back and views the world at a very big distance. It's almost mythic in that way. And the mistake was that the author didn't start doing that soon enough so that it felt more like a cohesive part of the story. I actually do quite like the chapter, though. The action is written well. It's emotional. It's tense. And you do need to see what the dragons can do to Equestria from someone's point of view other than Celestia's. I do think you need that.
Well, we can get that with the attack on Kennerlot, too, though. And I mean, don't get me wrong, it was a much-needed moment of, like, seeing the ramifications of her actions. It was just, I think it could have been done better.
But that one was from Celestia's point of view, and it's not nearly as scary. It's honestly, that one's a little drab if you ask me, because yeah, it comes in, it burns some stuff, and then it hits her shield and it leaves. It's not nearly as dark, frankly. The chapter with the dying Pegasus is one of the few points where the story approaches its dark tag. It's not still not.
There were houses razed and children crying for their parents and parents crying for their children, and we were none of them.
It's too distant. It's background noise. Whereas this one, you are in a character's perspective being wounded, mauled, played with, and killed. I think that's important. It's powerful.
All right,
exactly.
Fair point.
I don't know. I liked that the author started switching points of view. The problem was they waited too long to do it, in my view.
This might be separate from everything else we've been saying, but I plan to give my thoughts on the OCs, just generally speaking. Like, the author did a good job in making them very annoying, and like I definitely hated them, but it was more because of what they represented, like these holier than thou smug tyrants. In terms of characterization, that's not bad, but compared to the show's dragons, I just didn't buy that change. They are very much your typical elder dragon who is so much better and wiser than you. And, oh, silly ponies, you think you're cool. I'm a dragon. Obviously, I'm much cooler than you. Like, it's not an insecurity thing, but, you know, it's almost like you needed to shove cool, awesome dragons into the story to make it awesome and cool. But compared to the show dragons especially, it was just so different. Because something I like about the show dragons is that they're kind of stupid and animalistic and not what people expect when they think the word dragon. You know, you think dragon, you think regal and everything that these dragons are. But I was missing the dumb, stupid frat boys in my show.
Oh, I have a counterpoint. Just regarding show canon and stuff like that and their depiction of dragons. So this is as good a time as any to bring that up. But in the show, I think they are very careful to only show juvenile dragons. So we see the frat boy dragons and stuff like that in that one scene where Spike goes, hikes up the volcano for the dragon migration. We see some adult dragons in the distance, but like as he goes down into the caldera of the volcano, that seems to be like kind of the I don't know, the playground for juvenile dragons. That's where they are, and there aren't really any adult dragons in there. So that's kind of the whole caldera of the volcano is kind of a playpen, I guess. And that's where we see all the juvenile dragons. So adult dragons are an unexplored, facet of show canon, and which therefore leads some room for interpretation. Go ahead.
Counterpoint. Adult dragon in an episode, and Rarity gets swayed by it Rarity sways it with a little flattery. So when you see that episode where you have an adult show dragon where, fucking Rarity tricks it while stealing in front of it, and then you cut to this where Celestia is in a mob of them, and she's just bumbling her way through being submissive to these awesome elder gods. It's like such a splash of cold water in the face compared to what you see in show.
Spike's fake.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, say again, Scribbler?
He's Spike's fake father He's tiny, but he
Oh,
is
I
fully grown
completely
and he's
forgotten
an
about that
asshat.
part.
Also, the Dragon Lord.
Well, the Dragon Lord is still massive, though. That's one thing in his favour, for adult dragons being a little bit more mysterious and intimidating. But yeah, Spike's fake father is just a douche.
I will give this story that it was written in 20. So this was well before Spike's fake father and any of that shit happened. So you can't judge it on that. And that's, part of the problem, going back to looking at it from this point of view versus when it was written. You look at it now and you think dragons and you think Spike's fucking bumbling idiot weird father dude. But if you go back to this, like, the only example we really had was the migration and then that one red dragon. But that one red dragon was enough to make me think, okay, they were not intelligent creatures. I mean, if the main six could handle one, then it dumbs Celestia down so much, almost, to have her struggle so much with characters that are otherwise shown to be completely incompetent in the show.
The question of the question about dragon canon is still an interesting one, and it would be something that I would be interested in discussing further at another time. But for example, so we know that Spake Dad is he is an adult dragon. We presume he's fully grown, but he's not much bigger than he's not much bigger than pony size. Whereas the Dragon Lord is is huge and enormous, and we assume he's older than some of the other ones. But it is not age which makes a dragon grow. It's something to do with their power, like maybe their horde that they have, because there's that episode where Spike becomes huge despite being only a few years old. He becomes enormous as he becomes more greedy, as he acquires more and more things. So something about their magic, their power level, their the amount of hordes, or maybe it's some sort of psychic energy that they project. So the huge old dragons that we see in this fic may not be huge and old necessarily because of their age.
Well, fans tend to portray dragons more like that. I mean, that recent story I read, that precious than silver or gold. I mean, those dragons are extremely powerful, and they got big when they got greedy. So yeah, it's more of a fan thing, I think, than a canon. The canon wants to be a little bit.
Could be right.
Canon also kind of retconned itself a little bit with the most recent season, with Spike going through essentially what was a stage of puberty where he ends up growing wings.
Well, and I've seen several fanfics where you can spectrum of how to view the dragon progression, and as far as I'm concerned, the show still hasn't dealt with it enough that you can still do a lot in fanfic and not contradict anything. But I've seen fanfics where it explained dragons can grow massive due to greed, but it messes with their minds, or they get more powerful as they age. You can do both. And I've seen variations on those themes, and I think they all work together.
This story also attempts to be an origin story for Spike, and they have that discussion. Celestia puts the egg in a cell and puts some kind of charm on it so that it will stay heated in order to incubate the egg. And Chrysalis says, "Well, is that the right answer?" And Celestia says, "I don't know." And Chrysalis says, "Well, it's probably fine. I mean, worst case scenario, we'll probably get a dragon with no wings or something like that. Am I right? Am I right, guys?" Wink at the camera. That I think
I actually love that.
Really? I'm not.
Yes,
I think I kind of hate that.
No, at the time, it was probably actually a pretty decent joke, but it actually becomes an even better joke now that Spike actually has wings.
See, I hated it. The idea of variety in dragons. I really missed the idea of big Spike not having wings. I hate Spike with wings. I really do.
I do kind of. I have liked several fanfics where he is just a different type of dragon that doesn't have wings and has a different design. That is cool.
I think I like that also. Oh, hey, kind of goes back to our other discussion with the other fic that we did last week the last time that nobody liked, where Spike turned into a big worm in the volcano and was attacking Canterlot. Somebody tell me that fic. K-Sarasara, thank you.
K-Sarasara.
So that's sort of a similar. I do buy into that headcanon that the forms of dragons are sort of infinitely malleable, and that they're shaped by things like their environment and stuff like that. In one of the stories that I had written, we have another humanoid dragon that looks a lot like Spike, only because she was raised by a human. So I do like that aspect. Not like changelings, but think about like goldfish, and they'll just become as large as their environment will allow.
Chameleons.
Or they're just they're more elemental than any other, creatures in the world, and they take on characteristics of whatever power they're drawing from.
I certainly did.
It's better than the Dungeons and Dragons method, where a dragon's nature is defined specifically by their color.
That is racist.
I wanted to bring up one other aspect of the original characters. There's one character that probably everyone just simply dismisses, but I really enjoyed him because he was fun to voice, which was Boutonniere. And the reason I bring that up is because it illustrates the fact that there basically are two factions within the ponies. The militant faction who wants to war with the dragons, and the pacifist faction who wants nothing to do with war. And it was interesting that the ponies were fairly well completely divided on the issue.
I did like that there was an aspect to this story that made me think that it was playing with the idea that ponies in general are a lot more capitulary than maybe some of the other races in the world. They'll bend over backwards to try to make things work for others without fighting.
I hated that. I actually really disliked that this fic. I mean, with regards to Celestia's characterization, that's something I had a huge problem with, is that she was such a pushover.
So hang on, I left on Mami hating something and I've come back on Mami hating something else?
Just everything, probably
It's a
most
general
things.
theme.
Literally, it was just the line. It was literally just the line of, see, I hated that. And I came back and went, oh, did I step into a time loop?
I mean, that's just like true half the shit we're talking
What do you hate this
This
time?
time it's about Celestia, and Thornquill had made a point about how this characterizes ponies as being very, what was the word used?
Yes.
Capitulary, where they're very passive and everything. And that was something I really disliked about Celestia's characterization, is that she was such a doormat this whole fic. It was just, oh, now this is happening. Okay, well, this is what people think. Well, I want this, but no, this is what the people need. And it's like, yeah, there is a level of that in a leader, but I didn't see any leadership in her.
True. I would agree with you on that. I would also agree that, make the point that she did not seem at all powerful for effectively a sun goddess.
Not at all.
Did she even cast spell during this entire thing? Apart from like the barrier she put around the changelings, I don't think she even dips into her power as an alicorn at all.
Nope.
He never does.
She
never
not once.
does. She's got a cadre of little ponies she sends out to do things.
She casts a massive barrier to protect Canterlot and effectively repels Julian's attack. So she does at least do that.
I don't think it was over.
She's always on the defense.
A lot of Canterlot itself was destroyed. I got the impression that it cast a spell around the palace, and even
Yes,
that
you're
by
right.
the end, like under a sustained attack, like it got kind of whittled down to it was just a cone protecting her and the few ponies huddled around her. So she is not very powerful in this one. That's another problem I have, where I think this clashes with not only my personal canon, but also what we've seen in the show. We've seen big laser battles, between Celestia and Luna before she gets banished to the moon and stuff like that. Although technically I get that used the elements of harmony, but
And then there's Shining Armor, who was able to put her around the entirety of Canterlot.
and he's presumably less powerful than Celestia, right?
I would say so.
I will say this version of Celestia is in line with the version of Celestia that we had seen up to season 2, however, in that this version of Celestia was knocked out after about 5 seconds of fighting Queen Chrysalis.
I agree.
Except that in 2014
At that
we were already
point, though,
up
this
to
fic
season
was
4.
probably well underway, and I don't blame the author for not changing it.
We hadn't had.
Nope, it was all put out on the same
Also,
day.
Well,
what did
presumably they
Celestia
didn't
do in
write
season 4? What did we see?
Yeah,
When
Right,
she
the big
surrenders to
DB
him?
battle.
That was Twilight. With all 4 alicorn
I don't know
power.
about that. I mean, in terms of in terms of just we see what alicorns are capable of more
But what
by
did we
season
be
4
seen
than we had by
specifically?
season 2.
I'm not.
Don't
I'm
ask me these
just
questions.
saying. I know
I am the
Twilight
ideas
has
guy, I'm
shown
not the answers
incredible
guy.
power, but like Celestia and Luna, even now, I wouldn't say they've done all that much that's like jaw dropping.
Well, see, that was a bit of Celestia having cunning. I mean, that was her showing that she does have the propensity to be able to come up with schemes, because the whole bit about her giving up her power was not her submitting to Tyrek. It was her knowing, okay, there is a good chance if I keep this that Tyrek's gonna get it. But there's this fourth chick that he knows shit all about because she doesn't do anything. So if we give her all of our crap,
give the Princess of Books all her power, then it'll be there. It'll be safe because no one else is.
Yeah, the useless one. Here you go.
It's funny because Twilight is probably the only one of the Alicorns that actually is pretty active in the show.
Yeah, I take issue with this is the one who doesn't do anything. Excuse me, what the fuck?
Yeah, I mean,
how many times has she saved your ass?
To circle back around, I will agree that Celestia feels a little underpowered in the story, but I don't actually have a problem with it because so many fanfic authors overpower both unicorns and alicorns to the point where they can't write a story around them because they should just be able to solve everything with the right thought. So I really don't have a problem with her being a bit more, let's just say, a realistic part of the world and having some limits placed on her. I'm really okay with that.
I disagree.
See, it's not even about her not being powerful that I have a problem with. It's the fact that she isn't the one who saves the day in the end. She isn't the one who helps her people. She's the one who fucks over the person who saved her people. Like, if she had been the one to come up with the plan to steal the egg, it would be an entirely different conversation we're having right now. But the entire story, she's almost like a bullying idiot. She doesn't do shit the entire time, if you look at it, really.
Or just does thing wrong. Her justification at the end, where she does Inkstain has given her impassioned, and then Celestia says, like, no, you can't. And Inkstain says, no, you can't do that. This is wrong. And Celestia says, yeah, but I thought with my heart last time, and then I ended up being wrong, and a bunch of people died. So now I'm just going to just be a contrarian and do the opposite of what my heart thinks, because that seems the right thing to do. So yeah, I think I agree with the bumbling idiot assessment.
Yeah, honestly, you're right there. The story started to be at risk of falling apart in the middle because Celestia does become very passive. What bugged me was, met Queen Cocoon, she stuck her in a cell, and she basically decided, I'm not going to do anything about this. And even the story seems to forget about her for 5 or 7 chapters. I thought that could be an interesting conflict where she's trying to appease Queen Cocoon at the same time she's trying to manage the conflict with the dragons, and they're just getting worse and worse because she's managing it wrong. Unfortunately, the story doesn't go that way, and it just, like, Celestia chooses not to deal with it at all. It started getting a bit boring there.
And even when she's, like, seeing that she's starting to starve to death, she's just kind of like, oh, well, I'll walk a little slower. I won't do anything about that. Like, I just don't. She would be that caring, even about someone who's supposedly an enemy.
No, that was a problem.
This was right after Cocoon saved the whole kingdom. They're making their escape through the forest with the egg. The day is saved, and Equestria will not, perish under 1,000 years of night or whatever it is the dragons have planned. So, and she's like, it's like, I'll slow down a little bit. That seems fair.
I must admit, I kind of like the idea, the headcanon that the changelings' holes in their hooves are when they haven't had enough love, when they are unsustained and starving.
I like that too.
I do kind of like
That's
that idea.
I think that's more or less confirmed by show canon now. Yet when they're all maxed out on love, they turn into gay deer, and it's I think there's some sort of continuum where the holes in their hooves get filled in. What?
I protest this. Being gay does not make you into a random psychedelic deer.
For changelings specifically, when they get over some sort of whatever threshold of love, then they turn into gay deer. Yeah,
they're metrosexual.
Kevin is very metrosexual, or whatever his name is, Thorax.
Kevin's gay. No, it's not established in show canon why that happens, and I mean the whole fucking hippie deer thing happens when they give all of their love. So if anything, that debunked it. But comic canon, which isn't official canon, I know, does say that it's because fucking Celestia blasted a bunch of holes into Chrysalis. So there is that. I forgot
about that part.
Okay.
I kind of like how the comic handled Chrysalis's origins too. Like she was just born evil.
As some people
I've
are.
only read up to
Yeah,
about episode
I'd love
40
that.
of the IDW series, but I don't know that.
It wasn't part of the main stories. They did a micro series where they had like 6 issues, and each issue focused on a different villain. And Queen Chrysalis was the last one there. And it was sort of her in a jail cell talking to Twilight about all of these different misadventures she had had in trying to conquer different pony civilizations throughout history. And it was very, very interesting. And at the end of it, we see that she was just basically formed. She literally sprouted out of a tree from like some sort of dark magical sludge. It was actually really creepy.
I think it was specifically said to be like a carnivorous plant too. So like she is full blown as born evil as you can get. And I love that. She's just a fun, I am evil because I am evil kind of villain. And you so get that with this Chrysalis. And you don't have to. I mean, at this point, this Chrysalis is almost sort of an OC because this is kind of universe at this point with how canon has progressed. I just don't think that the Chrysalis we get in this story would naturally become the one we get in the show.
It's a very dark implication, and boy, it's kind of surprising that the comics of a kid's show would raise the idea of original sin and things like that. I'm not sure I like that. That canon either. That was she was just born that way. There's no nurture versus nature. There's no there's no illusion of choice. You just if you're evil, then you're just bad. And
well, the part of nurture versus nature is there is some nature where people are born with positions. And I mean, it's not like we're talking psychosis here either. Like she's a fucking carnivorous love eating, and in the comics too, like when they eat love, they reduce their victims to like skeletons. I mean, you just see cities littered with practically dead bodies who aren't dead for kid reasons. So she is like a predator. Like they do not joke around with the fact that this is a predator species.
Well, that was an ongoing question I had, is whether this idea that changelings feeding on love, inherently harmed their food source, their victim. I was not aware of that. If that was in the comics, I'll have to go reread that now. I supported the. I supported the idea that maybe if the love is taken forcibly, then that harms the victim. But if it is given freely, then it does not.
It doesn't, in my mind, matter what the comics did, because there's not enough of it in this story for us to work with. Yeah, the authors, again, relying on the idea that changelings do hurt ponies from the Canterlot invasion episode, but it's not defined enough from that even. The story needed to define whether changelings actually hurt ponies or if it could be done in a more passive way, and it never did that.
I think I'm going to make that my current headcanon, that if love is stolen forcibly by like impersonating someone impersonating someone that a pony, for example, already loves, if they like take their place and sort of steal love artificially or trick them into giving love, and that is inherently harmful. But if the love is given freely, then it is not. It's essentially an infinite resource, and it does not harm the victim.
Yeah, and that's a really popular headcanon, and it's pretty close to what the show canon is.
The changelings somehow managed to are self-sustaining. Their love for each other now just sustains them and gives them all the love that they will ever need.
I mean, integration even touches on that point, albeit very distantly.
I really wish Luna had been here for this, because every single podcast she brings up. Yeah, this is the first time we've had changelings actual changelings in a while, and she's not here.
Her own fault.
You sounded so cockney then. Her own fault.
Yep.
Right, shall we go into point 5? Backstory. Do we feel like this is a well fleshed out world, or does it feel like we're missing a lot of information? Thornquill, you came up with this point, so elaborate, please.
I mean, I already talked about it quite a bit, just in terms of how the lack of backstory is, I think, why Celestia and a lot of other characterizations feel very broken. I personally especially would have liked a bit more backstory on the dragons. We get that line about why they want the sun and the moon, but especially about 3/4 of the way through the story, I'm thinking the dragons, they're willing to go to war. They are taking a bit of a risk. They don't maybe think they are, but they clearly have a very powerful desire for the sun and the moon to go uncontrolled again. And I really wanted some perspective on why this was important to them. I wanted more information on the changelings, what they were in this world, what their past conflicts with ponies had been. There were just a lot of questions that I felt went unanswered, and I thought the story suffered for them. But if anyone else has any other thoughts on that, have at it.
I agree, and I think you said it all. The dragons, I thought, was passable, although, like I said, what the dragons had planned for the sun and moon, and how badly that would affect Equestria and all the other sentient races is an open question, a very, 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 very central one. But yeah, we needed more information about the changelings, definitely. Dragons, maybe not, but yeah, we definitely needed something a little more fleshed out.
I just feel like the dragons are more like perhaps Satan in the Bible, where Satan's just mentioned a little bit, and the fanon of the Bible has fleshed him out completely to a goat or a thing with horns and a tail. And that's sort of what we're left with the dragons. I think it's okay to just have them implied.
I kind of love that description of religion being fanon of the Bible.
It is, really, yeah. And the changeling thing, I think, I agree with Thornquill that it needed fleshing out, but I don't agree that it would have taken a great deal of effort to do it. I mean, all we'd have to done was establish that regardless of the changelings' intentions, when they feed, ponies die. If they would have just said that in some way, it would have taken a great deal of time to explain it, and I don't think they did, and that was the problem.
Just briefly interjecting, I got one of my coworkers. So I live in Utah, as you know, it's full of Mormons, as you know. One of my coworkers was mortally offended, and I do regret saying it at the time, but saying that the Book of Mormon was a fan fiction, and I know a thing or two about fan fiction, and I can spot a fan fiction when I see one. He did not take kindly to that statement at all.
You're not supposed to tell him
after the fact, but I'm kind of sorry, not sorry. So sorry. Sidetrack conversation. Go ahead, Thorny.
Oh, what was I going to say in response to Ilya's point? Sorry. It might be gone now.
It was too good a story not to.
It was just that something that really bugged me about it bugged me. Hey! I'm on a roll today. About when Celestia had just put Queen Cocoon in her cell. This was an excellent point to have an expository conversation about what did the changelings do before? What are you like now? Why do you want this? And Celestia doesn't ask her any kind of questions to try to get information about why she's there, how things have changed, or anything. And it just drove me nuts.
The author didn't give a shit, so she didn't give a shit.
She does seem like pretty ignorant about changeling culture and their stuff like that. She says, queen is more a biological term and stuff like that. So Celestia clearly has no idea how changeling society works, despite being thousands of years old. I think we have she might have an opportunity for the very first time in history to start a meaningful dialogue and, start relations with a changeling. It's just like, don't kill her now, but throw her away, throw her up. Lock her up and throw away the key. No!
That's going into war territory, which is a whole different thing we're not going to talk about.
Freudian slip.
Throw her up and
was it Freudian? Was that what you were really thinking, Neighrator?
No!
So now we're finding out about all those kinks that you wouldn't have told us about if you'd had the required amount of sleep.
This is getting very uncomfortable.
I have no idea what my original point was, but it's gone now, so I'm ready to move.
That's what happens when you leave it to entrance.
Yeah, I think we've established that this story needed more of its own lore.
Needed more of its own lore?
Okay. Oh, cut all of this out.
One last note.
Nope. This is all staying in the podcast.
One last note on the dragon when it comes to world building. I have to wonder about the conflict that supposedly happened between them before all this. Like, it would have to have been largely political for it not to have any effect on the world around them. But with the way they just descend into absolute bloodshed at the end, like, I can't imagine there wasn't some violence, and I don't believe that no one knew that happened.
I mean, if you take this as your standard, somewhat progressive medieval fantasy type world, just setting things on another continent is justification enough for no one knows about, because there's no cell phone cameras and there's no internet and there are no memes, thank God. So there's no way for anyone to know about a dragon conflict if it happened far enough away. And it is established the dragons came to Equestria to do this. They, wherever they are, is somewhere very much removed.
They can fly.
Yeah.
Ponies
But that,
can fly.
That doesn't mean they ever leave their area. Honestly, it's established that they almost never do.
It's established that their cloud homes move.
So, doesn't mean they move very far. This is something that, honestly, fantasy as a genre has to struggle with when it comes to the modern world. Honestly, if Harry Potter had been written a couple of years later, it wouldn't have worked at all because of cell phones. And it's very hard to...
That J.K. Rowling very clearly said that that's why she set it in the early 90s. She said because modern technology would have spoiled the story I was trying to tell.
It's very hard to write in an older universe because readers today can't get their heads around not being able to find out about something a few minutes after it happens. And they don't get that. They don't get that people don't cross. They don't get that, frankly, up until the 1900s, it was extremely unusual to ever leave the city you were born in. That was your entire world, and you knew next to nothing outside of it.
Let me just illustrate, as the oldest fellow here, that you will continually realize as you age how much you are alienated from the world in which you live. It just keeps happening.
Oh no, people are stupid.
Oh, it's already happening.
There was a fantasy novel I read several years, and I've actually completely forgotten even what it was. But the author, about halfway through the story, wrote that the characters come in contact with these marvelous magical artifacts. They're little earpieces made out of bone. And when you enchant them together, they resonate when something is done to the other one. And you can use them to communicate across huge distances because far apart they are, they do the same thing at the same time. So you can use them to talk to each other. I'm like, you don't fucking need to invent cute little fantasy cell phones to make your world work. Just have the characters take a few weeks or a few months to figure out something happened. That's actually more interesting. Don't shoehorn modern technology into a setting like that. It's so awful.
Or you can use stuff that's at the time. It's
Well,
I have to stop to appreciate that pun. I was going to say carrier pigeons. To be honest, I was going to say something logical, but that's kind of squashed any. Yeah, I was going to say pariah pigeons. Fuck off. We'll go with narrator's pun.
I weep for all of you when you discover In Another World with my smartphone.
I've heard of that. That's anime, isn't it? Isn't that?
It was a light novel that was adapted into an anime about a kid who dies and gets reincarnated in a fantasy land, and God says to him, you can take anything with you to this new world that you want to take with you. And he decides to take his smartphone, which convenient not only makes him akin to a god on Earth in this new world, but also has apps on it that allows him to access magic and weaponry and unlock special talents in the harem he eventually ends up getting. It's stupid.
How did he charge it?
I remember there being a Power Rangers where the communicator thing that they usually have
Magi Ranger
is a phone.
And
that's how they all transform, is they all got these phones. Is that it? Yes. I gave up watching after the first series. But yes, I remember looking at that and thinking, oh god, no. And that was like 2005.
Yeah, we have now gone way off track, but...
Let's bring it back
Yes,
around,
but it's been cathartic. Do we have to? I want to keep shitting on smartphones some more.
Even get a smartphone until like 2 years ago, didn't you? Amazing.
Well, 2019, so it's not quite 3 years yet. And I use it a lot, but I tend to use it for everything except its actual purpose. I use it for everything except a megaphone.
See, I still don't have one. There's
Oh, do you not? You're a longer holdout than me.
I have a tablet, but I mostly just use that for when I'm recording. I use it as the thing that holds all of my scripts and my PDFs. But there's no point in me having a smartphone out here because there's no fucking service anywhere.
Mine's essential to my business. I couldn't function without it.
Man, same. Seriously.
I'd just go crazy if I didn't have audiobooks to listen to and to be able to talk to you guys on Discord. Plus, I just boot up, like, fanfictions to read on my lunch break. Whenever I have a lunch break, which is not often.
Let's end the podcast here. This is a good stopping point, right?
We'd rather talk about lunch.
My dad's listening to something in the other room, so all I can hear in the background is this really ethereal music. Every time somebody's making a silly, smutty joke, and there's just this oh in the background. It's really weird.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, it's certainly making this an interesting audio experience.
Was the pun earlier about piston? Was that it? And then fucking choir music in the background.
See, that was when there was a Lloyd's TSB advert came on, and this is a chilled out version of "You're Not Alone." So Neighrator said that, and so they got "You're not alone."
Fucking vor jokes.
I don't think my mic is strong enough to pick up on half of this, but yeah, it's amazing for me to listen to anyway. Okay, point 6. Impressions of the prose style. How does this story read? Is it trying to achieve any particular tone, and how well does it achieve this if it is? I'm going to go with Illya first because it was his fic pick. So, presumably, I know you read it cold, but presumably you had some notion of the prose style when you started, and it was what made you want to carry on. So how do you reckon the story reads in general, Illya?
I thought it read really very well. I mean, points aside, and dismissing the plot issues and holes and things, I thought it was written in a style that matched my voice, which is what I'm always looking for. And of course, it had dragons and things, but I think it held its tone well throughout the story. I mean, a few things might have been fleshed out a little bit better, or it did, or such, but it had a nice style. I enjoyed it very much.
It was it was well written in terms of just the descriptions. Like, functionally, the actual narrative is very well. And there were a couple times where I think it accidentally switched pronouns for some of the OCs, so that made it a little hard to follow, particularly in the first chapter. I don't know if that was just me not knowing how to fucking read, or if the story actually did that or what, but there was a bit where I was like, hang on, okay, Key, and now Dragon is a girl, and now this one's a boy. That made it a little difficult for me.
You're exactly right, it did that, and I bought that move.
Yeah, so that was a little confusing.
I thought so, but I thought that I got it wrong because I was listening to it and thought, oh, have I misheard this?
It was with Zhu Yan right at the beginning. They described him and then switched to her. So
that's what I thought.
We could have had gay dragon. Damn it.
Well, that would have
been
kind of disturbing, the end, where one of them kills the other, but
they're all gay. Every character in the story is gay.
Well, it's not like there isn't a... I was going to say, it's not like popular media hasn't brought out the bring out your gays joke over and over again. Well, just trope, I should say. Fucking hate that. So I'm going to carry on quick before I go on a rant.
Were there problems with perspective shifts?
Yeah,
I think it might have been harder to notice since I listened to half this when Illya was reading it. Did everybody else notice perspective shifts?
No, there were some, especially in that last chapter where suddenly it switches from Celestia to flight stream, jet stream.
I'm glad I'm not the only one that noticed that. Overall, the prose was written very well. That's a forgivable technical issue, I guess. Overall, it was pretty good.
I don't really have a whole lot to add. Problems with characterization aside, I do think that the actual writing style of the fic was very well done. Every once in a while, like you said, I did notice there were some issues with pronoun or perspective shifts, but I do like the way that it was written. It did have a bit of a more mythic quality to it, and it pulled off that mythic quality a lot better than stories like Que Sera Sera were trying to do it.
Thornquill?
I liked overall the writing style as well. It definitely was one that would have benefited either from a proofreader or just a more thorough proofreading by the author, because we've talked about the pronoun shifts and all that were left in. There were actually more in the comments where people had pointed out a name had been switched or something else had gone wrong, and the author fixed those later after the fact. Which, you know, in fanfic, none of it's quite professional, but a little bit more would definitely help the story. One issue that I did have was just in terms of description, when the author is waxing a bit more poetic, they need to be just a bit more careful about their word choices, especially early on. They were talking about the dragon tunnels, and they accidentally mentioned a cobweb being cowed by the presence of the passing dragon. And I'm thinking, well, a cobweb can't be cowed. The insect can be cowed, and the spider who made the cobweb could be cowed. A cobweb cannot be cowed.
Well, was that
and
just personification?
Another chapter in, they mentioned, you know, the blue sky hanging over her that was held up by the mountains. And I'm thinking, well, is the sky hanging or is it being held up? Just a bit more care when you're waxing a bit more poetic to try to keep the connotations of your terms consistent would help it flow a little bit better. Other than that, I would say it achieves its tone pretty darn well. As for the perspective shift, again, those I'm fine with. Multiple point of view storytelling is absolutely a thing. You just want to be a little bit more consistent in how you do it. Like, I think the first half of the story is just Celestia, and then you start getting more perspective shifts, even to where there's not even a character looking on. It's just the narrator telling you something. So you want to be a bit more consistent about that. If you want to do multi-point of view, either do it very sporadically, so it's just consistent that you almost never do it, and when you do, it's for a very specific reason, or do it just with the same number of chapter shifts, like every three chapters you switch perspectives, something like that, so that it doesn't feel unequally weighted throughout the story.
I think perspective shifts were important in this story because we needed to be led along a path as far as Inkstain was concerned. We needed to know what her perspective was just up to a point where we're not revealed that she is Chrysalis. So that was fun to go into her perspective shifts. I thought that was kind of nice.
Yes, you're right. And I think the author realized they couldn't tell this story entirely from Celestia's point of view because despite being almost a goddess herself, Celestia can't be everywhere at once, and she can't see everything that's happening in the story. I really wish Inkstain could have been a point of view character. In fact, I think she should have been, and I think she should not have been Queen Chrysalis, because you really can't write from the point of view of a character that's hiding something like that. It becomes very awkward because they're constantly dancing around something in their mind, and the reader's going, what the fuck is with this turn of phrase? You know, that sort of thing.
But I think that's fun.
It can be. But it's like writing, like, imagine you were writing a 300-page novel and half of your perspective is from a character who knows the entire time he is going to stab this other character literally in the back. And he's constantly thinking about this, constantly planning it, constantly interacting with characters who knows he's planning it, but he never once thinks about it because he doesn't want to give himself away to the reader. It can get very awkward.
Yeah, I'm sure it would.
And that was actually something that bugged me. This is off topic, but why was Inkstain, like, terrified of Queen Cocoon? Like, she's mentioned as trembling in her presence and being all freaked out. How is that consistent with her being Queen Chrysalis?
She wasn't afraid of Cocoon. She was afraid of what might happen between Celestia and Cocoon, what might happen to the Changelings. That was one of the fun things about it, was showing her fear, but it was misplaced. We were led to believe it was her fear of Cocoon, but it wasn't. It was her fear of events surrounding Cocoon. And I thought that was really well done.
Oh, that's reasonable, yeah.
Yeah, I obviously needed you to clear that up for me, which wasn't great, but I'm glad that it is cleared up, so thank you.
Something I will give this story is that it definitely has reread value. So once you know all the twists, you can go back and pick out, oh, this was handled particularly well. Oh, that's what that scene actually meant. So it does have that going for it.
Rereadability is actually fairly lacking in most fanfictions, unless you give it like a good 10 years or so. But this one, yeah, I will admit the rereadability is there at least once. Does anybody have anything to add on this point, or shall we move on?
I will say it was very dark all the way through. I mean, I know that it was, looking at the tags, you would expect that sad, dark tragedy, but there was like no moments of brevity. It's almost like when you're doing gore and it's constant gore the whole way through. You have to have a breather so that you can refresh yourself before you dive back into it.
Yeah, that's why I read Boutonniere as a snot, just to give it a little levity.
I did laugh when Boutonniere talks about how, I can't remember exactly what he said to Jetstream, but he says, well, you're not used to this. Your home moves whenever you want it to. And I ruined the line there, but wherever that is in the fic, it did make me laugh.
That was in the second chapter when they're in the council, and he's shouting at Jetstream's trying to put together a fighting force, and Boutonniere just replies with, "Why do you care? Your house moves." Yeah, I've always believed that in order to be more, for want of a better word, realistic, there should always be some levity in situations, or at least the characters attempting levity, and it doesn't always work. When things become so very dark that there's absolutely no way of anybody using any coping mechanism that other than the same uniform writing style all the way through, it takes me out of a story. I like it when characters attempt to, I don't know, failingly joke about their situation and then realize, this isn't working, is it?
What was good about your reading of Queen Cocoon, because you put this sort of unctuous Morticia sort of feeling into the character that made it sort of humorous, and that sort of thing is what we try to add as readers.
To be honest, I just tried to play her as a more sarcastic Chrysalis.
This is a challenge that I actually have failed at. I, at one point, tried to write a story from about Princess Luna. So, of course, most of it that I had managed to get was from her perspective. And I hit a really bad wall that I never managed to get around in not keeping that tone so boring, frankly, because as a result of her position, she can't be close to anyone beneath her. And as a result of the point in the story, she had no one else to be close to. And I couldn't figure out how to bring anyone in who could change the tone and make it more dynamic. And I realized writing from a perspective of a royal character like that, whose world is very different from, your more standard fantasy character, is a very unique challenge. And I know other fanfic authors have dealt with it much more successfully. I still have not quite figured out how to do it.
So, impact of the line, was there ever a real Celestia? Now, this is said by Chrysalis at the very end, when Celestia, having had the rug completely pulled out from under her, asks Chrysalis, was there ever a real ink stain? To which Chrysalis then replies, was there ever a real Celestia? Now, somebody brought this up in the Discord chat way back when we were first putting together this document. Does anybody remember who that was?
Not I.
I'll take that as a no. In which case, Neighrator. Neighrator, what do you think of the impact of the line, was there ever a real Celestia?
So right at the end of the story, Celestia asks Jetstream about the investigation, and Jetstream replies like, yeah, as near as we can tell, the identities of the ponies that you just banished were original ones. We haven't found anyone with that likeness anywhere we've looked, which lends credence to the thought that changelings do not have to impersonate necessarily do not have to take the form of somebody that already exists, that they can sort of find someone original, although that the author may contradict himself on that point. But at any rate, Chrysalis asks Celestia, is there ever a real Celestia? I think she's what she's saying there is like, I am as original, I'm as real as you are.
I think I can try to move this point towards some direction, unless anyone else wants first go at it.
Please.
I'm not gonna lie, this line had absolutely no impact on me. I don't think it was built up to correctly. I think the author wanted there to be a couple of themes regarding the changelings. And of course, since you spent no time fleshing the changelings out or even talking to them, it's very hard to build a theme. But during the brief conversation with Queen Cocoon, where she says, we might take someone else's face, but when we bring them into our new city, we build a new identity. We make ourselves their identity. It's almost like the author was trying to build this theme that the changelings have their own identity and the ponies don't understand that. If that's the case, it didn't come through to the point where I can't even completely explain why I think that. And there's another theme with Celestia where I think the idea was that her banishing the changelings is turned back around on her. And once again, she has banished her best friend. First, she banished her sis, then she banished Inkstain because she couldn't see through something. But again, I can't tie this theme together consistently throughout the story. I don't know if anyone else is able to piece that together more from here.
See, I don't think that Chrysalis should have been the one to deliver this line. I mean, it works as is. It has enough impact, but I think it has more impact for the reader having read Celestia's thoughts. And when it comes from Chrysalis, it's almost like Chrysalis has been reading Celestia's mind. Because the entire fic, Celestia has been, like, giving these little hints that history has highly embellished her actual role in Kingdom. And we see that at the end where, suddenly she's single-handedly taken on the dragons and slaughtered everybody, and that's not at all what happened. So this does have impact, but not the way it's delivered.
So how could this have still been included how could this line still have been included in a way that made more sense than Mami?
See, I think it would take a lot of rewriting of the fic to get to that point. I would argue that maybe Celestia should have said this about herself. She's always having these talks with Luna sort of at the end of every major conflict. So after saying that, I think it would have been more appropriate if Chrysalis had done something to hint more at the Chrysalis we get in the show, because I still really don't believe that this line came from that. So I think that maybe something else should have happened in the moment, but then later on, Celestia is self-reflecting and realizes, well, oh shit, was there ever a real me?
Yeah, there's a lot of missed opportunity, both, well, simply with the changelings, but with the changelings and with Inkstain in particular, because Inkstain is Celestia's only confidant in this story, but she doesn't really do much other than be there so Celestia isn't talking to herself. If there was some way to have her more on equal footing, like as more of a surrogate to Luna, in that she can show Celestia, yeah, history has made you out more than you are again and again, and here once again you've made yourself out more than you thought you were, or something like that. But she doesn't have enough of a role for that to work the way it's written.
Good point.
I'll just throw my 2 cents in there and say that when I first looked over the schedule for this and saw that this was a talking point, I was kind of surprised, because when I first read that line, I didn't think of it as a wham line. It just did not hit me that way. I just thought it was Chrysalis being a bit snide and just trying in some way to launch to launch one last insult at Celestia, but I didn't really get any sort of connotation from the line.
That's all I was saying. I didn't either. Just that, yeah, if there was any especially profound impact that it was supposed to have, I think it was lost on me.
Illya, you want to go and then I'll say my bit?
No, I really was just going to reflect on what Goombasa had said. It was just a jab to me. I mean, she said, was there ever a real Inkstain? Speaking about, a real pony that Inkstain became. And Inkstain turned it into an insult of character. And was there ever a real Celestia, or were you just lying the whole time? And it's sort of a throwaway insult to me.
See, that's the kind of what I interpreted it as it was meant to be more impactful for the reader than it was for the characters. And the idea of Celestia has one of the reasons that she hates the changelings all the way through, and the reason she cites is that they're inherently deceptive. It's one of the reasons that she says, you need to die. Your very nature is deceptive and dishonest, and therefore you need to die, all of you. And then it turns out at the end that in actual fact, she was far more dishonest and deceptive than any of them were. And I thought that that was meant to be something for the reader to reflect upon. Or maybe the idea that since she had talked to Inkstain about why the fact that she wasn't going to take the Changeling's plea for clemency seriously, the Inkstain does try and insist partway through, you will take it into account. Maybe we need some new friends. And she's trying to angle Celestia's thoughts towards the idea of the Changelings being allies, with the idea that Celestia was taking her seriously. And then she finds out that Celestia never had any intention of ever even entertaining the thought of doing anything with the Changelings but using them and then enforcing the law that was already there.
So I think that could have worked too, but this relates to how and why Celestia decides to banish them at the end. I know I've heard it said that she's a conniving character through this story, or possibly is. And I've also heard it said that she's just bumbling through. I'm on the line that she's more bumbling through this, because the way that I read the final chapters where she brings Queen Cocoon in and she brings her council and she brings all the changelings in, it's like she is trying very earnestly, almost too much, just in terms of writing style, to convince everyone the changelings just saved us. This is a great time for us to reconsider our views of them and to start building an alliance. And it's strange because the whole time she's protesting how the ponies are reacting to the changelings. She's trying to, keep things turned to a good note here. And then on a dime, she's like, actually, you're right. And then she imprisons the changelings and exiles them. I don't think that was, if it was a premeditated move, it wasn't written as one. I'm not sure what it is, other than the author felt it needed to happen, and so it happened, but it does not work. And yeah, if that's why it doesn't work, then that's why this last line doesn't work either.
She did actually premeditate it. When they're heading back towards Equestria from the Dragon Caves after everything has gone on, she has this sense of guilt, and she has kind of this internal struggle going on where she's almost self-loathing in a way, where she's like, "Didn't trust me," or just little details like that. There's like little bit sentences peppered in throughout the fic, but especially at the end there, where it's Celestia is very much, "I am a deceitful character. I'm just as bad as the changelings." Like, she recognizes that about, and she does talk about this plan she's cooked up in her head. I think that her arguing with her court was her last-ditch effort to try and fight something that she saw as inevitable, which was her betrayal.
I don't suppose you remember exactly. I want to read those bits myself because I clearly missed them.
Yeah, they would not.
I'm looking through the last chapters now, but
They were there. They were there.
I will take both your words on that. But yeah, then I clearly missed that.
I did also. I just skipped right over it when I was reading it.
It's mostly in the chapter where she goes for the egg.
Yeah, it is the sequence where they head to the Dragon's Caves, formerly Changeling Caves, and Celestia is periodically having a bit of an internal monologue to herself about how she's a terrible, terrible pony. But we don't know why until she casts that last on a heel turn spell. I can words.
You don't think that was her feeling bad about having to steal an egg, and that's why she's feeling bad about herself?
Yeah, I always thought it was going to be about the changelings and how she was using Queen Cocoon, and she knew she was using her. And Queen Cocoon was doing all this to get clemency for her people that was not going to come.
Okay, I found a bit in chapter 14 that I think might be what we're talking about. It says, "The triumph of retrieving the egg had overwhelmed her, but her heart was not free to celebrate. In a few minutes, she would have to finalize a plan that had brewed in her brain and corroded her heart. When she had first thought of it, it seemed the right thing to do." And then we move on to, people filing in and all that.
That is really, really awful. That is...
Yeah.
I missed that completely, but that completely changes my feelings about Celestia in this fic.
Well, and it kind of reinforces my point as well. It's very difficult to write from the perspective of a character who is planning on a betrayal if you're trying to trick the reader at the same time as the other characters. As what this fic has done
True.
is that
You're right.
half of us completely missed the point.
I started hating her the minute I read that line. It really started ticking me off that they're not going to do this. They're not going to have her betray them. But of course I knew they had to because it's canon, but it still made me so mad. I hated Celestia.
Circling back around then to just like Celestia was just completely out of character in the story, and I don't think it works. The author would have had to have done a lot more work before I would believe that Celestia was capable of any of these things.
Yeah, because this is supposed to be a tragedy, and Celestia is supposed to fail at the end, and this is her failure. The problem is there's not enough justification that's led up to this for us to even see it carrying out as something horrible. It just doesn't make sense.
Well, fortunately...
Are you positive?
It's a joke.
Are you sure?
Want a joke right now.
God.
Well, I was just going to say that fortunately she's redeemed by having that big, beautiful butt with the sun on the side of it.
Oh my god!
God damn it, Illya.
That pulled me through the whole thing. I was able to recover.
Oh my God.
I'm telling Luna what you said about her sister.
I am so
It's
mad
Alec
that reminded
or
me what I
Harem.
wanted to say. I believe that this Celestia would do that betrayal. I don't believe that canon Celestia would betray someone like that, because the Celestia presented in this story is very much the kind of insecure, cowardly type who would, at the very end, realize all of my decisions have led to bad shit going down, and I've had to be saved by someone I thought was like a mortal enemy up until this point, and my people won't accept that. So I buy that Celestia would, at the very end, be like, oh no, it was all me, and you have to get rid of this person. Well, she doesn't say that it was her doing, but she does get rid of the people who helped her, and she knows that the ramification of that will be that she is glorified. So I buy that this iteration of her would do that, but I don't buy that she would do that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, if this story had been set maybe a couple hundred years before the show, give her some time to go through some more life and become the character that we knew, maybe you could pull this off. But a couple of years, nah.
I've been working on in my own head. I think I'd been assuming this was about. Oh gosh, no wait. This couldn't. I was thinking it was like 50 years before, because Canterlot has just been destroyed completely, and so I would figure it would need to be around 20 years. But she does also say that changelings don't live that long, so in order for that to be the same, in order for the timeline to work, it couldn't have been more than like 10 years or so before the events of the show.
Yeah, it's too close.
Yeah, I did have a question about the timeline, because this seems to be in the ancient past. Like with the establishment of the Wonderbolts, we know they've been around for quite some time. And yet, Spike's an egg and he needs to be hatched soon. So I kind of put it down to either dragon egg incubation takes hundreds of years, or something was very fucked up with this timeline.
It's hard to know for sure, because someone else can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think there's anything that specifically, definitively states exactly how long it is. But especially since this, I believe, was written before the Wonderbolts' history was given in the show.
Yeah.
There's not a lot to say that the Wonderbolts weren't just founded a few decades ago. And the bulk of the story, I do feel, is written closer to the show rather than farther off.
I believe there's a line in the very first chapter of the fic that says that Luna has been imprisoned on the moon for nearly a millennia. So it's not quite at the 1,000 years, but it is fairly close to canon.
Yeah, that's a big part of where I got that, yeah.
I'm not sure. Yes, I'm not sure the timeline works out. It would have to be far enough in the past that they've had a chance to rebuild Canterlot, which has just been completely destroyed, and also like not in in Pony's recent memory. So less So less than 50 years ago, but also more than, or I should say, but yeah, between 50 and 10 years ago, I think is where that would have to fall necessarily.
I think they state somewhere in there, when they talk about the banishment, they say nearly 1,000 years, which is, it could be.
950 could still count as nearly 1,000 years.
Which, speaking of Spike's egg, do we want to move on to that point?
I think we're ready.
That is the next point, isn't it? Yes. So our next point is, what do we think about Spike's origin? Now, I'm trying to work out who hasn't spoken in a while. Goombasa, what do you think?
I don't really think it's handled very well here, mostly just because it feels more like a side note to the end of the story rather than a focus of the story. Like, it's made very clear that the egg that they steal is Spike's, but I never really saw that as important an aspect to the story as everything else that was happening around it. Like, this could have been any random dragon egg, and apart from distancing itself from canon, I don't think it would have affected very much.
Illya?
Well, I just sort of feel like if it hadn't been Spike's egg, what's the point of keeping it? It's a throwaway point to me.
I don't buy that Celestia would be so flippant about the caring of the egg. Like, if the incubation is off by a few degrees, whatever, when it could be, like, completely dead, just freezing cold. But I mean, like, do I buy any of Celestia's characterization in this fic? Not necessarily. So there is that point. A lot of my feelings about Spike have been covered, but one last point for me was, why would she keep it secret in the dungeon if she's then going to make it like an official royal test for children to try and...
Yeah, that did feel a bit weird. It did feel like a lot of that end bit was, oh, this is to explain why Spike doesn't have wings.
Well, she did take the one Wonderbolts guy down there and show him the egg.
Yeah, for no reason.
Yeah, that was an odd thing. It did feel like he should have more of a character if she was going to show that to him. That very much felt like, and now I'm going to talk to the audience for a bit.
Yeah.
Like, he's not the only person who experienced loss in this fic, but it very much is framed as, oh, this is the only one who will understand of all of these side characters that we haven't developed.
Yeah. Thornquill, what do you think?
Well, once again, I'm going to disagree a little bit, because I actually think that this was really clever on the author's part, because they'd written themselves into something of a corner. They had subplots which were not really meshing well together, and they had dragons that were so overpowered they clearly could not be fought against. I liked that they resolved this by basically cutting the dragons apart from the inside and taking something that they couldn't do anything about. The way I thought it was going to be at first was that she would use Spike as a hostage. Basically, if you keep attacking us, you will hurt the thing that supposedly you care about the most and that unites you. It also worked just having the fact that the dragons couldn't even keep this together or protect it. They suddenly, they couldn't forgive that each other, and that started their war again. That also worked. It might even have worked just a little bit better because Spike is very clearly not being treated as a hostage in the show. And having that the Changelings had a way to know where the egg was, a good way to tie that in. I thought it was clever. And just in terms of personal taste, I like it as an origin story for him better than I like a lot of theories that have been floated. I like that he was spirited away from his own family, desperate ditch effort to save Equestria, as opposed to he just ended up there or his parents died or anything like that. So I actually do like this bit about the story quite a bit.
Okay then. So we'll move on to the next point. 1 second, I've just closed the window by accident because I'm a dumbass. Which is the plot? Laugh at me. Which is the plot and which is the subplot? The Changelings or the dragons? Or are they on an equal footing? And this point was submitted by Illya. So, Illya?
I really don't have any strong opinions on it. I was just curious about it. I was wondering what everyone else thought.
Goombasa?
I would say that they're on relatively even footing just because of the way that they sort of lead into one another. Like, the changelings come seeking asylum, then you have the problem with the dragons trying to take it, and then the changelings offer a means of stopping the dragons, and we see the two plot points converge into one before separating again, where you have the dragons fighting each other and Celestia banishing the changelings. I think that they were on relatively equal footing.
Neighrator?
I think the author probably meant for the dragons to take precedence and be the fore of the story, for just because of the title, if nothing else. To be honest, I think I've definitely focused on the changeling aspect a lot more, because despite Equestria being faced with an existential crisis, I think it's so sorry about that. I definitely focused a lot more on sort of the unintended consequences of what the author wanted to do with the changelings and stuff like that. So I think the author may have meant for the dragon problem to take the fore, but I definitely focused a lot more on everything that happens with the changelings.
This may be a nonsense question anyway.
I don't think so.
Why would you say it's a nonsense question?
I mean, it's important. It's just it's a nomenclature thing, really. What's the plot? What's the subplot? And I just thought that I was wondering if anyone had a strong opinion on it. So
the title, I think I was expecting a story about dragons exclusively, and then some changelings showed up. I think a story exclusively about the dragons, if they had kind of focused in on that a bit more, and gone a different direction other than this business with the changeling. I think that might have been a story I would have preferred to read. That's just me.
Thornquill?
There's a few things I can say to that from a technical perspective. And I think that the dragons are very definitively the plot, and the changelings are the subplot. There's a few for that, and I think there's a reason why it's a bit more confusing. The main two reasons why I think the dragons are the plot is, one, they're the ones we spend the most time on. We probably spend a fifth of the amount of time on the changelings as we do the dragons and all of the consequences and events revolving around them. The other more technical reason the dragon plot is introduced first. Generally, the plot that introduces the story should be the main plot, not always. I'm sure there are plenty of examples against it, but I'm just thinking, take Game of Thrones. It starts with the White Walkers, and despite all of the unbelievable number of plots, subplots, characters, and all of that, it will also probably end with the White Walkers. They are the main overarching theme, even though we don't necessarily spend the most time on them. And that is the other technical point that I think is confusing, is that, again, you don't have to do this. It's not a firm rule, but something that can be helpful in structuring a story is what you solve the plots in the same order, or in the order that you introduce them, or in reverse order, I should say. So I would think if the story was structured a bit more properly, you would introduce the dragon plot, introduce the changeling plot, solve the changeling plot, and then solve the dragon plot. I don't think that's possible with the way this story is set up, but that can actually be something that can help keep things a lot more clear to your readers, what's important, and help them follow the story a bit more easily.
Mami?
In terms of the plot and everything, I think the changelings and the dragons are both the doms, and the real sub here is Luna, because it's kind of carried throughout the fic, but it doesn't ever take the forefront, whereas the changelings and the dragons both get kind of their own spotlight.
I guess so. I must admit, I was kind of hoping that Luna would, I don't know,
beat Celestia with a rolled up newspaper.
There's never enough Luna.
Says the person who was talking about Celestia's butt earlier.
Hey, I can have other interests. Besides, she's on the moon.
So it's season 1, episode 1. And Nightmare Moon has just returned, and she says, "The night will last forever." Ah, ha, 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 ha. And then she talks to Celestia for a second. She's, "Oh my God, sister, you banished all the changelings after they saved the kingdom? That was fucked."
Like, I'm evil, but holy shit!
Right?
The real reason she banished Celestia is because she saw that shit go down. Right, taking over. My turn.
Yeah.
Also, yeah, I mean, Luna was kind of just Celestia's background motivation. Like, the story had to keep reinforcing, Celestia's scared to lose her sister forever, that's why she doesn't want to do anything. I just kind of want to know, another question that never got answered, how did Celestia know that the summer sun celebration was important? Because she knows that Luna will be back after 1,000 years, presumably because of the prophecy. But the summer sun celebration is what draws Twilight to her and sets those events in motion. How did Celestia have that specific a foreknowledge of what was going to happen from this story's perspective?
Well, we've covered this before because we've talked about how much does Celestia know, how omnipotent, what's the word, omniscient is she about things, and how much is just accidental.
Well, they do have visions in the show.
I suppose it's just, again, it's a very strange little point that the biggest threat to her is that if she gives up the sun and the moon, then the summer sun celebration won't happen. Why is that important to getting Luna back? Presumably Luna could come back anyway. The celebration doesn't have anything to do with it from a lore standpoint.
Because MacGuffin.
I was going to say, back in like early season 4, if that was when this was written, there wasn't really anything in canon to contradict the idea that the summer sun celebration wasn't important. So it could be they're just assuming that it was, and there was nothing to contradict that. Mami?
You caught me at the exact moment that my girlfriend distracted me. No, sorry.
I thought you were tapping to get my attention.
The problems with attaching it to the space bar become apparent now.
Right, we'll move on to the next point then. This is another point by Illya. Although I realise that the dichotomy is necessary for the conflict and resolution of the story, how do we feel about the balance of power between the longevity and the omnipotence of the dragons, as opposed to the rest of Equestria? If not show canon, then how far off is it?
Well, I always just, in this story, I just felt they were too powerful. They were just like, nothing could stop the dragons. Not even all the combined races of Equestria. And I didn't like that. I don't know why, but I really didn't. It was necessary, like I said, for the plot of the story, but it bothered me.
How did you feel about it, Thorny?
I know that, unfortunately, I think Mami and I will disagree on this point again. I actually...
Come at me.
Pretty much. I actually very much prefer the idea of dragons as more powerful and more noble beings in fiction. That's just how my tastes run. I'm with Illya on that point. And so I actually did like how this story set up the dichotomy between the dragons and the rest of the world. I liked that the dragons were on a god level tier. The only thing that could bring them down was themselves. They had to be taken down by themselves from within, because otherwise they would be the power controlling the world. I thought that was a clever way to approach it.
I will fight you. I'll fist fight you right now.
Go on then, Mami. Go on.
It's not that the dragons were executed in a poor way, especially with regards to the power and the longevity and their omnipotence. I think all of that is fine for what they are. I just don't like what they are because they're not a fun villain. Like, that is something fundamental that I think the story is lacking, is any element of fun. Like, it's a fun read if you're looking for drama and angst, but it's just angst the whole way through. And yeah, I do like that traditional depiction of dragons as these very wise, very regal beings, but you get that everywhere. Like, I can pick up fucking mystery, goddamn, what mystery has dragons in it? Fucking fantasy novel from a bookstore and read about fantastic, wonderful, wise dragons, but with this specifically, I can expect a subversion of that trope, and I like that subversion, specifically when it comes to ponyfic.
Yeah, and I absolutely appreciate that point too.
Goombasa, would you like to weigh in?
Well, no. I don't really have a whole lot to say on...
Back away slowly.
Yeah.
No.
I don't really have a lot to say on that point, I don't think. I actually kind of think that this is a point that we touched on earlier, didn't we? When we were sort of talking about characterization.
I have just a few things to say. Maybe not that. So in terms of the balance of power and stuff like that, not so much that the dragons are overpowered. I think I'm pretty content with their canon and sort of where they sit in their place in the world, but just that Celestia was so underpowered by comparison. She just offered pretty much no resistance at all. As the dragons are raising her city, she manages to cast a very feeble barrier and doesn't counterattack at all. So dragons, I'm fine with them, but just sort of relative to Celestia and sort of her general passive and pushover nature, and also the amount of power she's able to exhibit. So not inherently that the dragons are so overpowered, but just that Celestia seems somewhat underpowered. Yeah.
Again, would require extensive rewriting of the story for that not to be a problem. Anyone want to add anything, or should we move on to the last point? Okay, we're moving on, because it is, in fact, nearly 3 hours this one's going to reach, I think. Oh, this is going to be a bitch to edit.
Sorry, this is an appropriate length for this length of story, I think. So I think we're more on par compared to one of Goombasa's fics, which is supposed to be super light and just comedy, and we talk about the same amount of time.
But at least we're consistent.
Dragged you into it.
Well, it's like, I just remember Thornquill's was like 2,000-ish words long, I think, and we managed to talk for 2 and a bit hours. Does the story's ending feel satisfying and fitting to the story that built up to it? Does it accomplish its goal of meshing with canon events further down the timeline? This one was suggested by Thornquill, so Thorny.
So the reason I brought this one up is that for me, I feel that the ending is where this story really broke down completely. I feel that the author tried to check too many boxes and plug into canon in too many ways, and that is where we were talking about the perils of writing a prequel, was how much can you make things line up. So the author needed the changelings to become enemies, and they needed the dragons to not have eaten Equestria. And I think that the real problem is that it bends over so far backward to make changelings the enemy when not enough justification is given. That's where the story breaks. They wrote themselves into a corner to make that all happen, and they couldn't write their way out of it, I feel.
Illya, what do you think?
Well, it seems like this. I'm glad we have Thornquill here. I feel Thorny is a real writer, and he has a lot of interesting things that I never would have thought of every time. And this idea of trying to squeeze in too much canon is something I hadn't thought about before, but that's a very good point. I think that is one of the stumbling blocks of the story, right? It just tried to squeeze much of the television world into the story that it didn't have to. Good point. That's all I've got to say.
I have absolutely no gracious way to respond to compliments like that. So you are too nice to me.
That does require everybody in the comments section to pay Thornquill compliments, because then he's compelled to respond to them.
No! God, no. No.
Yes, everybody compliment Thornquill, please.
Oh, there he goes.
It must be done.
Yes.
Oh, there he goes.
Oh, no.
The word of God hath spoken it.
Oh.
Yep. Goombasa, what do you think?
I'm pretty much in agreement that the fic itself, I won't say I had a great time reading it, but I thought it was mostly inoffensive for the most part until I got to the ending. And we've discussed Celestia's character a lot throughout this podcast. That was the moment where it kind of retroactively made me hate a lot of the scenes that she was in earlier in the story, just because of that one moment where it all sort of falls apart, where she betrays the changelings, and it just did not feel justified. The ending of the story felt... It could have ended on a more tense note, with maybe a tentative truce between the changelings and the ponies, and it would have been far more satisfying. a little bit more uplifting, but would have left room for the reader to fill in the blanks down the line, like what happened that made the changelings and the ponies split after that tense truce that they had. To end it on such a downer note, I think was a really big mistake.
The whole thing was a downer.
Yeah, that's what I mean, because like even though it wasn't exactly a happy victory, if they had ended it closer to just Celestia stealing the egg and averting the war, that would have added, at least I think, a tint of hopefulness to the story. Certainly not for the dragons, but for the ponies, perhaps. But the fact that it ended the way that it did, feel like the writer was making a very conscious effort to keep bringing the story down in terms of its emotional payoff.
That is a weird switch, especially considering this was very obviously written with the expectation that things then go on to become canon. So that is so happy-go-lucky and lighthearted, and this is so not that it's kind of it's just a really hot and cold kind of thing for trying to be a prequel to canon.
Neighrator, what do you think?
As sort of an origin story for Chrysalis, I think that works really well. I think that completely explains if I were Chrysalis and Celestia had pulled that shit on me, like I would absolutely fly off the handle and just do whatever I could to destroy her. That's that serves as a good origin story for Chrysalis, I think. I think not so much, or fair at least. Seems a bit strained, but that's acceptable. I could buy that. But for Celestia, just like she's just so out of character in this whole story, I just think, and it kind of overshadows everything else the author was trying to do. So not super well. It does not really serve as a believable prequel to what we see in the show.
Mami, did I say your name already?
I gave a little bit of my idea. I mean, I'd really just be reiterating that I don't think, especially with regards to the second point, I do not think it meshes with canon at all. And I think the story suffers for trying, because in trying to explain so much of canon and in making this kind of an explanation of everyone's backstories and why this one particular event happens in canon, it forces itself to be something I don't think the story wanted to be. I think there were a lot of interesting ideas here that could have been explored in much better ways with better characterization, but the plot needed things to be a certain way to pan out the way they needed to pan out. So a lot of it is just because the plot said so, and that doesn't work for me.
Because the plot said so, the enemy of all fiction everywhere. Would anybody like to add anything to this last point before we go into final thoughts? Okay then. I love it when nobody fucking responds with, nah, I think we're good. You just leave it to fall into the silence of, yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm worried about talking too much.
Teacher called on us, trying to be inconspicuous.
No one wanted to raise their hand.
You were all those focus who are in the class going, right,
yep.
Everybody who has something to say, clearly, because you're all talking over me, so let's hear a discussion.
No, I was totally that person in class.
Go fucking past. You will be. Write me 100 lines. Except that you would be the person that when you actually get called on would come up with a brilliant point, and I'm sitting there thinking, well, why didn't you fucking say it before?
Either that or shrivel into a miserable husk and never speak again. It both happened, honestly.
So, final thoughts then. I will end with Illya since it was his story. Mami, what do you think in your final thoughts?
It is still a good read for what it is. I just don't think it worked for what it was trying to be, but if you're looking for an interesting story, this is something to look at. And definitely listen to Illya's reading of it, because everyone who was in it was amazing.
Apart from that ink stain shit.
No.
Shit stain. That was the actual name of the actress. Shit stain.
Well,
Neighrator, what do you think of the story?
Despite my objections about Celestia's characterization, she did seem really, really out of character with the Celestia with the scene that we see in the show. I actually still quite liked the fic, and Illya's reading in particular Illya and everyone in the cast, Scribbler, did it.
No.
did a great job with the reading, and so despite my problems with it, I actually still quite enjoyed it.
Thornquill?
First off, I'm going to risk sounding like you, and you're a ridiculously good voice actress, Scribbler. Fuck off.
You tell her, Thorny.
I'm with everyone else on my final thoughts on the story, I think. I think it is still a better story than a worse one, and I did enjoy it for a good part of it. The premise and a lot of the ideas they come up with are just really so strong, and they carry the story even with all the characterization problems. I think the biggest things I would fix would be more world building, so much more world building.
I'm sorry, the thing you would fix? I said fic.
Yes. Okay. Yes. The biggest thing I would about the fix. The fix. More world building. More world building. Spend more time with the changelings. My God. Just don't put one in a cell and leave it there for half the story. Yeah. And just maybe a few more questions in regards to the dragon's motivations, and I think it would be quite a bit stronger.
Goombasa?
It's a good read. I don't think it's one that I would particularly go back to. I didn't see a lot of the rereadability that a lot of people did. But yeah, I'm with Thorny 100% on this. It's got really strong ideas. The execution is middling at some points, but it does have those strong ideas that are good enough to keep me invested all the way to the ending, as disappointing as it was. I do recommend going and listening to Illya's reading of it, because, as is often the case with a lot of fics that we do that have readings of them, the reading just adds so much more to it. Except for that Chrysalis VA. God, they suck.
Oh my God, not you too.
Do we need group therapy?
See, I said the Chrysalis VA was the best one in it.
No, stop this, all of you.
I mean, apart from that amazing narrator, but I don't know who the hell he is.
Some doofus.
We will fight you.
This is why we need Cygnus.
I'll fight you, laddie. I'll fight you on the beaches. I'll fight you in the fucking fanfiction, don't Nate.
Well, there's no Cygnus here this week. We have to be self-deprecating to make up for it.
I'll fight the Cygnus too. Illya, final thoughts, please.
2 points and then a final thought. The 2 points are we should have gotten to know why on the changelings. That was a problem. The other one is Mami's point. There should have been more humor in the story. I would have appreciated that. But in finality, in the final analysis, I think the story was a lot of fun. I enjoyed reading it, which to me is the mark of a good story. And the only part that bothered me was how much it made me hate Celestia. And I would have to say that that's probably a point in favor of the writing. If it made me feel that strongly about her, then it must have been fairly well written, even though I don't like disliking Celestia. So, but no, I think it was a great story. It wasn't, great literature, but it was a lot of fun, and that's what I wanted.
For my part, I thought it was a pretty good story. There were large stretches of it where I got quite bored, but I don't know. I think your mileage may vary on this one, depending on how much you can tolerate Celestia being seen as the manipulative, behind-the-scenes, ruthless ruler versus the motherly version from canon will affect how much you enjoy this story. So, if you've listened to us waffle about it for this long, and you haven't read it, and it sounds intriguing to you, then go and check it out. But now, before we clock off, we have to, well, I don't have to spin any kind of wheel this week because there is only one person who is able to choose next time's fic who happens to be in the podcast today, and that is Mami. So, Mami, furnish us with the fic you have chosen for our next podcast.
I have picked The Mundella Effect by Force, who is a fantastic fucking writer and definitely needs the attention. And this fic, fun fact, is, first of all, mercifully short, so the podcast will be 5 hours long. And it's been rated as not recommended by a reviewer already. So I'm hoping to change that for some people.
Oh, out of interest, which reviewer?
Titanium Dragon?
Wow!
Yeah, there you go.
Boom!
Changed immediately. Goal accomplished.
Bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays out for him.
I think his reason for this was literally he just didn't like the thing it was based on. So,
That being said, though, I frickin' love how in the description of the Mundella effect, the author put "not recommended" by Titanium Dragon, where most people put where their accomplishments have been. I love it.
This is my recommendation.
Wow.
I love her.
Wow.
She's awesome.
Okay, I kind of like the author more now. Well, we will save for next time. Thank you very much to everybody for listening. We are gonna clock off now and go and do things with our Sunday. But before we go, we'll say words. Fuck off. Yeah, that's just my phrase to get myself back into narrating and speaking properly. Is if I make a mistake, I just say fuck off, and instantly I can speak again. Yeah. So, fuck off. Everybody's gonna say goodbye now. Say goodbye, Goombasa.
Bye now.
Say goodbye, Mami.
Oh shit, you skipped till bye.
I always end with the person who picked the story.
I'm an idiot. Shut up. Yeah, fuck off.
No, it's I'm an idiot. Fuck off. Neighrator?
Just goodbye.
Thornquill?
Good luck, everyone, after this. See you next time.
And Illya.
Have a wonderful rest of the day, and fuck off.
I will not tell everyone to fuck off. You're all great people, I'm sure.
Too late, you said it. Out of context. We found that Count Dankula said context doesn't matter, so you said fuck off in that sentence, so you've told everybody to fuck off now. Fuck off, everybody! Bye!
Well, it's an audit. We can... Bye. Just edit that in, Scribbler, later. Just edit it.
I give up.
After you tell Thorny to say goodbye, just say, fuck off. Just splice it in.
No!
No problem.
I try to be nice to people, thank you.
I'm always nice to people. It doesn't mean I can't tell them to fuck off as well.
Fuck off is like well-wishing. Like, I hope you get some action.
You're all so strange.
Like, I'm English. We just put the words fuck off into random conversations. It's like it's a punctuation.
So this is going in the episode, right?
Yeah, this is going over the end music. If it's not over the end music, then people will wonder what the hell. There's always stuff over the end music.